Welcome back. My name is Emerette, and this is RPG Unlimited, a podcast about tabletop gaming. I'll be interviewing players, game masters, artists, game designers, developers, and content creators for their unique views and processes when they play and or create tabletop role-playing games and content. Today we are talking with Naomi. They are a game creator, and if you would like to check out their work, you can find them on itch.io, Patreon, and inker.fm. Hello, Naomi. How are you doing today?
Hi, I'm doing all right. The fact that it's a Friday night is really helping with how I'm feeling.
Fridays are awesome. Tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, for sure. So, as I mentioned, my name's Naomi. I make tabletop games. That's one of a lot of things I do. I'm also a podcaster, and for the sort of official during the workday reasons I'm excited it's Friday kind of reasons, I'm an educator. I currently am working in music education. I primarily think of myself as an environmental educator, but I've bounced around working in multiple fields and with multiple age ranges. So I've also done peer mentorship work, LGBTQ advocacy, like trans resource education trainings. And also I have a master's degree in education with an outdoor environmental education focus. So that is something that increasingly has sort of helped feed into where I am now, which is someone who has gotten increasingly into tabletop game design, because a lot of the ways that I approach and think about design are informed by my background in education. And I managed to swing with one of my advisors when I was in my master's program to let me write one of my culminating essays about how I thought educators and game designers could learn from each other, especially in terms of thinking about things like dynamics of power and control in classroom spaces and how to talk about those and demystify those to students. I think a lot of GM-less game design tools can be mobilized in really fun ways in other fields, especially in education. And I think a lot of educator tools, especially for group management, can be mobilized in fun and useful ways for gamers and game designers. So yeah, currently what my life looks like is I work in music education, and when I'm not doing that, I meet up with game play groups, game design groups, work on projects with my friends online, brainstorm with them, and so far this year I've just been doing a lot of game jams. I think I'm making 2019 the year of game jams for me.
Awesome. For people who don't know what a game jam is, what's a game jam?
That's a great question. So game jams can look a few different ways. When I'm talking about them, generally I'm talking about things that are being run online. I've been mainly on ones through itch.io, which is a site that primarily has been used for people making video and other kinds of computer games, but you can also use it to share things like PDFs or text files. So increasingly, folks who do tabletop game design are realizing that it can be a resource site that we can use to design and share our work. So in a game jam, there's generally some kind of time limit and some kind of level of formatting suggestion for a game. It might be write a game in a particular style, in a particular medium. If it's more of a computer game, it might be we're all writing games using this kind of software, this particular tool or asset. In tabletop scenes, often it means something like we're trying to write games of a certain length or games based on a certain kinds of rule system or structure. Or often, in the ones I've seen, games where there's some kind of theme, and a lot of the rest of it is left really open-ended. And so you have this time limit, you have this idea, and because it's being organized in this shared digital space, you have this shared community of people who are also working on ideas. So it gives you a chance to get some brainstorming help, to get some support, and also for me, one of the key things that honestly just helps is it gives me a deadline. It tells me that during February, I'm going to work on writing a game that's about animals committing crime. And that's one of the things I did in February. The Felonious Fauna game jam was deeply delightful, and that was inspired in part by the already existing, very small, simple and charming and weird game Honey Heist, which is about bears committing heist-style crimes. So yeah, folks submitted dozens of different games, and the one thing they all had in common was that they were tabletop games that involved animals committing crime in some way. And there were other more nuances to that description. But yeah, game jams on the whole, they're a format where they give you a time structure and an idea and a sense of community while you're creating something, and that can be really supportive and motivating for people. And because they often have relatively short time blocks, work on this for a week or a couple weeks or a month, for me that helps me not overthink things. It makes projects a little less intimidating because I know that I don't need to make this the biggest, most detailed possible thing it can be. I just need to make something that feels like an interesting, playable idea and submit it within this time window. And if I want to come back to it later, then great. And if I feel like I've finished it there, well then cool. I've learned something and I've created some kind of interesting game that's out in the world, and it will teach me things that I can use in other projects that I want to dig into more deeply.
That's really awesome. How would you say that itch.io stacks up to, say, DriveThruRPG and DM's Guild?
Well, I think the interface is a lot prettier than DriveThruRPG's. No shade to DriveThruRPG in particular. I feel like itch.io, it's also just kind of interesting in that it's new in terms of being a space where folks are posting tabletop things, and this may or may not be something I don't want to assume in either direction, but one of the big things that's happened lately on itch.io for tabletop games was the Emotional Mecha Jam, which was put together by a couple of folks on Twitter whose handles I'm blanking on. I don't want to misspeak handles, but look up the hashtag #SadMechJam on Twitter if you want to track that whole process, because the folks who put it together, essentially the whole premise was make a tabletop game that involves mechs, like giant pilotable robots, but focus on the emotive elements, not the combat elements. And the response was so huge. One, it created a partner jam where people made computer video games because so many folks wanted to do that as well. But something like, I think at last count that I saw, it was around 177 games were submitted to that game jam. And there were only a little bit over 1,700 physical tabletop style games published on itch.io at that point in time. So right now, roughly a solid 10% of all of the tabletop RPGs on itch.io are about feelings and robots. About 10% of the games there are from this one game jam. So for me, the big thing that I know about itch.io and it makes it interesting for me is that it's kind of a new space for tabletop games, even though it's more established for other game types. And so there's a lot of good creative energy, I feel like, happening in indie tabletop design spaces, talking about what can we make itch.io into for us, because we're in a great place to brainstorm with each other, to talk to folks who develop and work for the website, to figure out what it does now and what it would be nice for it to do in future, and to be active agents in helping it be a space that can be really well suited for how we want to work and share our work as designers. I haven't published things through DriveThruRPG and DM's Guild, so I can't compare the experience from a publishing perspective as a designer, but as someone who has only been writing and designing my own games and sharing them online within about the past year, I can say that itch.io was a very welcomingly intuitive place to figure out how to share my material, and that right now it's just a really good kind of sociocultural moment for tabletop design folks to be sharing things about itch.io and how to use it well with each other. I've learned a lot, literally just from my Twitter feed, about how to interact with itch.io in fun and useful ways as someone who makes, essentially print and play games where if you've got a text file or a PDF, you can play the game.
Okay, that's really cool. See, I know that's one of the things I'd seen recently was people urging each other, hey, maybe we should start moving over to itch.io. They are doing this thing where, yes, they are reaching out to our community and saying, how can we make this platform work better for you guys? And that was really, really awesome.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, it's an exciting thing to see happen. It's nice when a format is going, oh, people are using our site in a way that we didn't imagine, and it's cool, and we're excited about it. How can we make this a space for your games too?
Yeah, and that was exciting. As someone who plays, seeing something that should help creators is a push for creators actually getting the recognition they really, really need, and fair compensation. Yeah, that's huge.
Mm-hmm.
Can we have fair compensation? So excited about that. How did you get into tabletop role-playing games?
Oh, big question. There's a lot of answers I could give to that. The sort of going the farthest back one is that I was a theater kid. And also just an only child who got a lot of direct social attention and loved storytelling. When I was little, I'd just make up stories on the fly and record them into a little tape deck. So I loved that kind of narrative crafting. I loved writing plays. I loved performing. And then essentially I was in children's theater all through childhood, and then I got into high school and I kind of stopped doing theater because I was doing a bunch of other nerd things. Essentially, I was taking too many classes that were only offered in one class period of the day for me to be able to do theater, and I missed it, and it made me kind of sad and antsy about it. So then when I got into undergrad, at that point, like, I'd heard of tabletop games, but I was in a place that I think a lot of people are, where I knew that Dungeons and Dragons existed, and I'd sort of tried to play it once or twice, but I didn't have a very deep structural understanding of it, or of games more broadly. But what happened sort of during that arc was I got more into like design and direction from a theater perspective. I got to be more in theater projects where I was helping out my peers. I was, being an assistant director for student theater projects. I was co-writing things or editing things, and so getting to be a little bit more of a creative agent rather than just a performer. And then sort of near the end of college and then into the space between my undergrad and my master's program work, I started listening to a lot of podcasts because of just the time format of my days, and I had some weird commutes that were good podcast length. And I ran into the One Shot podcast because a webcomic artist, I believe, that I liked guested on it. And I started listening to that, and suddenly it was just, I was falling into this audio channel that was all these different tabletop games that I'd never heard of. All these little, 1 to 3 to 4 arc sessions where this group of improv comedians were playing a different game every time they started a new arc. And I really had no clue that there were that many games out there, or that was what tabletop games could be. But once I found out that it was, I became very, very interested very quickly. And I started downloading a lot of PDFs and trying to agitate my friends to play games with me. The first game I attempted to sort of facilitate was the older, original version of Avery Alder's Dream Askew, which was pretty cool, but also I definitely didn't know how to facilitate it. And so we played a slightly awkward, slightly fun game session of that for my birthday near the end of undergrad. But I just got more and more into playing things and trying to figure out formats where I could play things. And then I moved from California up to Washington for my graduate program. And I was living and working on an island teaching outdoor education to kids, in the Pacific Northwestern woods. And I'm glad that I really liked all my grad classmates, because it was 15 of us living in a set of small cabins together. And I don't drive, and there wasn't a lot of public transit, so I was living and working and socializing mainly with the same 14 people. So I started trying to find things I could do that were that. And I found some local story game groups that met in Seattle. And so I would take a bus and then a ferry and then another bus into a tabletop game and comic shop in Capitol Hill so that I could play games with people. And it was just so emotionally grounding and cool fun that I literally made the weird trek to do that, even though sometimes it meant I had to stay the night in Seattle in order to be able to get back onto the island the next day. And through playing games in those spaces, then I started running into people who were designing games and finding out about game design groups that met and getting collaborative support and mentorship through that. So it's not something that I really planned particularly. A lot of it came out of just wanting some of the energy that I'd had from theater, and then realizing that in a lot of ways, I like tabletop games better. They feel more collaborative. They feel more in the moment. They have things I like about improv without some of the things that I don't like about improv. They have some of the things I like about storytelling without some of the things that can be socially isolating about just writing for yourself. I like the way that they get to be unexpected and surprising, and I also like that they helped me form a social circle in a new place. So, yeah, I did not initially think of myself as someone who was going to start designing games But once the ball got rolling, it just started feeling like obviously the next thing that I would do because the whole process was so fun. Why wouldn't I try? That's the long answer. That's the very long answer. I can hone in on things, but there's the arc.
Hey, long answers are fine here. I noticed one of the things I've seen as a common thread through a lot of people I've already interviewed is, in fact, drama and improv. Do you think that that is a direct correlation, that people who are in those clubs or in those circles are more likely to really enjoy tabletop role-playing games than people outside those circles?
I think
not to say, hey, you can't play if you're not from here, or you won't ever be interested because you won't get it, but just an observation, possibly.
I think the framing that I would put to it is that if you have a background in theater or improv, you have some base skill sets that, if you're also excited about the experience of tabletop games, you can apply really well to tabletop gaming. That it gives you a sort of core sense of how to imagine that you're inhabiting a particular character and moving through the world through their perspective, and just like digging into a fictional world with a sense that it's a collaborative experience, where you're not necessarily in it to be competing with the other people involved. You're in it to tell an interesting story together. And I feel like that in particular is the thing that's true about a lot of good theater. Like you are there to share a story, but it also gets more internally focused. You're mainly sharing the story with the other people at the table as opposed to with an outside audience. I would say it cuts in multiple ways, because I won't name names. I'm not gonna hassle them, but I have a dear friend who was an even bigger theater kid than I was, and who's absolutely terrified by the thought of playing tabletop games. I feel like the other arc of it is that depending on what kind of theater you did, you may be very used to having a lot of things formatted out for you about the narrative that you're telling. And for some folks, performing a thing for an audience feels less intense and intimidating than performing essentially for your other co-performers. So I think that energy can roll in multiple directions, but I think especially like improvisational skill, it is definitely a thing that has a lot of core application, and I know that's something that I've used and appreciated being able to use in a tabletop game context. I've also seen just other threads. Like for me, I came into learning about tabletop games from this theater background. For my girlfriend, one of the things that drew her into it was more just playing video games, and also she really loves voice acting and like the voice actors for video games. And so for her, one of the things that she likes about character work is not that she has a theater background, it's that she has a long history of being a huge fan of voice acting. And so that aspect of the characterization, getting into character through your voice and your affect, is part of what makes it fun for her, and is a background skill set that she brings in because that's something she's thought about, practiced, and researched of her own accord. That. So I feel like there's a lot of tracks, but yeah, I'd imagine if surveyed, there would be a pretty high theater kid density in tabletop game spaces compared to some other pastimes.
Okay. And that brought to mind another thing when you brought up the point that for some people, performing on a stage in front of people is easier than performing in a private space for a small group of friends. Mm-hmm. I think that there is a slow move going on that kind of bridges both gaps, and that would be with streamed games, because you're doing both at the same time. I think that kind of could be a fair middle ground for both, and that it works for a lot of different things, because that works for people who are experimenting with voice acting, and it's another resource for, hey, learning all this stuff too. Like it's been great watching all these different channels that have been coming in and their different approaches and the communities they build and the kind of things that are being done is really, really amazing. I think streaming's really gonna kind of change the face of it. It seems that a lot of the change community, far as awareness of stuff, has came from the fact that a lot of it is becoming public now because of streaming. Is that something that you could agree with, possibly? Does that make any sense?
Absolutely. No, I think I like the way that you framed that, because I do think it incorporates elements of both, which sort of brings positives and negatives of both. But I feel like one of the big positives is it lets you have that sort of social collaborative energy of doing it as an activity with friends, but also enjoy the theatricality and the context of it being a performance that other people can observe. And I think people bring different kinds of energies when they know that they have an audience. And for some folks, that is really fun and enjoyable in terms of what it does for game flow and for approach. Like, I know I play differently when I'm on a stream than I do if I'm just playing with my friends. I don't think it's necessarily wildly different, but it changes my sense of pacing. It makes me think about my decisions a little bit differently. I don't make wildly different character decisions than I'd otherwise make, I think. But I think about, will this give my other players fun jumping off points, not just for their own personal entertainment, but for what they can do with their characters and how they can really portray their characters richly and interestingly in a scene. And I think it also, in a good format at least, encourages everyone involved to think about balance, because you're actively all together sharing some airtime. So are you really making sure everyone gets their space to perform and gets that airtime? Or if there's intentionally a different balance in that, are you all aware of that? Did you agree on that? Like, because maybe for one session you're mainly telling one story, but if you're performing, then that doesn't feel so much like you're letting other people down. It's more like, oh, we're doing this performance right now to boost this one character, and then maybe in another timer format, we'll be boosting someone else in a different way. But yeah, I really enjoy that about streaming. I think there's a lot of cool elements to that. I feel like the sort of negative inverse of that is that, and I mean, I say this as someone who is on a stream podcast right now and also is a podcaster, I feel like it definitely can also feel leave people feeling like they have to turn their hobbies into side hustles to a certain degree. It's like, oh, if you're having fun doing this, why aren't you also streaming it? And I think that's a thing where in some cases maybe they'd have a lot of fun streaming it. And also, I never want to say that there's anything inherently negative about just doing stuff for yourself too and enjoying it privately. But I think streams create really cool social spaces when they're managed well and thoughtfully, and also that they're good learning tools for helping people figure out how to interact with different parts of the medium, whether that means they want to get more public and produce more material, or whether they're trying to learn how to play in their own social circles, and they get to see essentially these shared, publicized, still social circles creating games together.
Yeah, I think that pretty well covers it. And yeah, I think a lot of people, especially when you start streaming and it is a hobby of yours, it is very easy to get wrapped up in, oh, hey, I enjoy this, I should stream this. Oh, hey, I enjoy this, I should stream this too. Oh, hey, I am constantly streaming. Hello, this was me. So, you created Beating the Binary. Tell us a little bit more about that.
So Beating the Binary is like my my common like handle that I use on a lot. My handle through itch.io. Adanarama is kind of the other main handle I use. Are you speaking about a specific part of my content that I've created as Beating the Binary?
Think so. I understood it as a kind of separate thing. Maybe I misunderstood.
Maybe a little bit. Yeah, it's more just like my handle that I grabbed because it's a fun handle to get to use on the internet when you're non-binary. But it is the main handle under which I like market my games through itch.io and under that context. But it is not itself a distinct piece of media. It, I guess, is still technically my Tumblr, but that one's mostly abandoned.
Yeah, Tumblr's been its own thing recently.
Gosh, it really has. It sort of drove me towards Twitter, which has its own weird dimensions, but also through Twitter that I've started, I feel like, having a lot of really fun and charming conversations and learning about different facets of the tabletop game community, so that I like. I'm sure there were good tabletop game spaces on Tumblr too, but I didn't find the same kinds of ones that I've found on Twitter now.
Oh, I know it's really hard to ask a person to choose a favorite baby. Or like, this is my children. They're all my favorite. I don't love one more than the other. Do you have one that you do enjoy a little bit more, that you put a lot more time and thought into?
In terms of the games that I've written so far? Honestly, the Firstborn, Market Magic, my 200-word RPG, the first game that I made and published, holds a really special place in my heart, in part because it's done. It's so definitively done, and I have no plans to rewrite it because I worked so hard on that thing to shape it and pare it down into a playable 200-word structure. But also, I really love Market Magic because it's how I broke the ice in terms of picturing myself as someone who could write games, and having the format of the 200-word RPG competition, this thing where I knew I had to make a distinctly tiny thing, where there wasn't room to overthink and add tons of addendums to it, or expand it out more. That helped me because I'm a really verbose person. When I write, I tend to use 3 adjectives where one will do, and then only sometimes remember to pare them down later. So it forced me to have this kind of brevity with my writing that I think was a good learning experience for me. And I also really love Market Magic because I wrote it trying to imagine how to make a game that would be easy to get my friends who don't think of themselves as tabletop game players to play. So it's a game that you can play if you have the little zine printout, or if you just have the text of it on your phone, and you don't need anything else with you to do it. You just need some kind of physical or digital space to explore that contains interesting objects. My vision for it, I had the idea for it while I was in a farmer's market, and my vision for it was, can I write a game that you could play while you were wandering a farmer's market with friends? Could you say, hey, do you want to play an RPG right now? And have them go, and then you can go, I've got one right here, and it will really genuinely work right here, and then to make it happen. And I can describe it pretty briefly for folks who have not heard of it, because it's a 200-word game. In Market Magic, you play a group of apprentices to a picky, cranky magician who collects magic objects. So you're each trying to find a powerful magic item that's going to win you favor with your boss. And so to do that, you either explore a physical space like a farmer's market or a rummage sale or a thrift store, or a digital space, like Etsy or eBay, or Craigslist. And everyone in the group contributes some idea of what this magician is like and what their tastes are. And then you use those to guide your search, either as literal search terms in a web browser or as ideas. And then you come back and you share the thing that you found. And you have to explain why it's the powerful magic item that's going to make you the favorite. And then it gets a little bit apples to apples, like you get to vote for the person who you think had the coolest item, and then everyone gets to share how, if they lost, how their item backfired, or if they won, how their item has a secret hidden power that is discovered when they present it to their boss. And it gets really wacky, and it encourages, I think, a very light, goofy form of characterization, where you sort of figure out who you are as this group of apprentices through discussing how you're trying to win favor with your boss. And it's also very low stakes. It's very fun whether you lose or win. Like, it's neat to win, but it doesn't have to be your goal. It's almost more fun to describe how your item backfires. Honestly, I've heard people come up with some really wacky stuff for that. So I love all the games I've written, but Market Magic, like, it's the shortest game I've ever written, but it might be the one I worked on the most. Because I worked on that one for a long time leading up to the 200-word RPG competition, because formatting it for that contest was a real journey. And I've also play tested it in an actual thrift store, and it was a blast. And one of the participants also just found a 100% genuine camel hair coat on sale for $5 while playing, and that wasn't the magic item that was brought back to share, but someone did return wearing a camel hair coat. So that's probably, I probably have written, probably not the only like RPG or LARP you could play in a thrift store, but I don't think there's that many that focus on that aspect, and I'm proud of that. I enjoyed that writing experience, and I definitely enjoyed that playtesting experience.
It sounds like a really fun game, and as you were talking about it, I had this scenario for a one-shot automatically jump to mind. And yeah, because my experience is with D&D. So this boss, this wizard, is a lich, and it's the minions looking for stuff for him to use as his phylacteries.
Oh my god. That would be so good. Oh, I like that very much. I feel like mildly relevant to what you said. The other playtest that I did while I was working on it, we played using our descriptive words for our boss as search terms on Etsy, and multiple people independently of each other discovered that there's a terrifying number of stuffed animals with real human teeth added to their mouths for sale on Etsy. I didn't know that was a thing, but it is, and 2 people came back with that as their item that they were going to present to the magician. So you could use Etsy as like a brainstorm mechanic for lich phylactery items. Like, I mean that 100% seriously. There are things on Etsy that are terrifying in ways that I could not imagine until I saw them.
Sounds like some people fell into the dark side there. Just a bit.
Yeah, it was a real experience, that game. Like, I'm glad we did it, but yeah, neither of the human teeth critters won because we couldn't decide between them, so they almost sort of canceled each other out.
Little unfortunate. Okay.
I'll remember them forever, though. I don't want to, but I will.
What has your experience as a game developer been like?
It's been a lot of having ideas suddenly and going, oh god, I better go on lunch break so I can write this down, and then doing that. I started keeping, like, in my work bag a separate notebook that's just game design ideas, because I feel like I keep having ideas partway through the workday and having to hold them in my brain until I can find a good moment to take a break and work on them. But happily, I get pretty flexible control of when I take my break. But multiple of my game jam projects started partway through a workday. A lot of my other experiential dimensions have just been feeling really excited about and grateful for how many things are on the internet about game writing concepts. There's so many random table generators and places where if I'm trying to riff off of a concept and I have a very loose idea, I can find a spot on the internet that contains some kind of tool or search engine that will help me find related ideas or concepts or words. It's made me really grateful for my friends, because I have a group of friends that I went to undergrad with, who I then turned into my D&D party, who I still sort of run games for online, but all of our schedules have started diverging, so it's gotten harder and harder to play games together. So technically we're running an ongoing D&D campaign and an ongoing Scum and Villainy campaign where they're dashing space criminals. But we haven't played either of them in a while. What's kind of happened is, because of our scrappy schedules, but the fact that we still have a group chat, is that instead of playing games together a lot, we're increasingly just poking each other on group chat and going, I have this design idea, or I have this premise for this one shot, or I have this thing I'm going to run. Because right now I'm the only one in the group who's writing full games, but most of them are running games for other groups or creating homebrew material or doing other design dimensions there. So I'll sometimes get home from work and open up my phone and see that there's 50 messages from my group chat because they're all helping design a fantasy biome, like, and figuring out what kinds of creatures to put in, like, a semi-enchanted grasslands area that's being controlled by an archfey, and things like that. And they get really deep into it, and it makes me really happy. And it also means that they've become really sweet and lovely resources for helping me playtest things and bounce ideas off of. So being a game designer is a lot of having ideas at weird moments in time, a lot of internet research, a lot of connecting with old friends in new ways that none of us could have predicted, because sharing creative work is so weird and fun. And lately especially, it's been a lot of really appreciating the heck out of tabletop game design Twitter spaces, because people share so many fun, weird ideas there. And I feel like we're all just sort of tossing game premises and concepts out into either because we're working on them and we want support and ideas, or because we hope someone else will find something to do with an idea, and so we want to send it out into the universe, which is how I ended up live tweeting a mini LARP about cooking that I wrote one evening when I already needed to do meal prep, and then people talking on Twitter about using cooking as a game mechanic, and I was like, well, I need to make lentils anyway, how can I turn that into a game mechanic?
That sounds fun.
I had a blast with that. It was good. Yeah, that game is not, like, published anywhere other than a photograph of my rough notes in a tweet. But that's something I'm going to put together soon too. I think that'll probably make another fun mini zine. I'll be able to have 2 little mini zines, one for my 200 RPG and one for a cooking LARP.
Those sound like really, really cool ideas.
Mm-hmm.
So.
It's fun. I'm grateful for, like, friends in internet spaces for helping affirm for me that you can take really weird little ideas and run with them, and someone else out there is going to be as charmed by it as you are.
That's cool. So what advice would you give to someone who is just getting into tabletop role-playing game development?
Do something tiny. Do something really, really small. Make yourself do something that's not super big. I feel like it's similar to a lot of the advice that I see when folks are asking webcomic artists, like, how do I start a comic? And they say, don't do your big idea first. Do a little thing. Like, start with something that you can finish. I'm really, really grateful I started with the 200-word RPG, because it made me have to pare an idea down to some really basic components and make something that was intentionally, thoughtfully small. And it was still hard. It was still an interesting design premise to work with, but it meant that I finished a thing, and that thing fits on one sheet of paper. It's really easy to share, it's really easy to link, it's really easy to talk about, so I feel like from a marketing perspective it's nice, but also I was able to finish it, and I didn't have to do hundreds of research, and I didn't have to do wildly extensive copy editing. It was everything fit on one page, and it let me really hone in on the thing. And then when I'd finished it, I got to print it out and fold it into a cool little booklet and hold it in my hands and go, oh my god, I wrote a game. It's really true. I genuinely wrote a game. No one can say I didn't. It's literally part of a game competition. It functions as a game. It's playable. I've played it. But I feel like, make something small, because you might be like me and discover that you really like making kind of charming games and that clicks for you. Or you might make this small thing and go, wow, that was hard. There's so many things I want to add to it. I could add this background element, I could add this mechanic, I could add this art, and that's told you something good too. Then you've given yourself a little heart, a little core framework that you can build off of. But do a small thing first. The other thing I think is, if you're like me and you have friends who like playing games but don't necessarily design them or test them, ask them if they want to try your stuff out. They won't necessarily, but you might be surprised, and they might enjoy the break and flow. And especially for me, like, having this friend that mainly played D&D, I don't think they would have played a whole lot of other just random tabletop games they hadn't heard of, but when I said, hey, I'm working on a thing, would you like to help me test it? I have that shared foundation of being their friend, and so they were willing to try that out and have fun with it. And it also meant that they gave me really thoughtful feedback that was, like, very warm and kind, because they're my friends and they know me well. But also very pointed and thoughtful, because they're my friends and they know me well. So they know what my tendencies were. They went in and said, Naomi, you need all these adjectives. Naomi, that sentence is very repetitive. Naomi, you can probably remove 2 pages from the length of this game if you need to, because you repeated yourself a lot, and not in a way that was mechanically necessary. But they told me that with love, and it worked really well, and I was able to refine down my game for the emotional mecha jam really well, because I had help from friends. So yeah, like, use your game community resources. And I don't mean, like, think of people as resources, they're not also your friends, but if you have friends who you like doing game related things with, introduce them to this new dimension of your game life, and they might have fun with it too. Maybe even in ways that they don't expect. But especially, and at the core, start small. Do something where you can finish it and feel what it feels like to have finished that project and revel in that, and then move forward off of that in whatever direction makes sense for you.
Awesome. Great advice.
Thank you.
You're a podcaster as well. Believe it's Queerly Yours, correct?
It is, yes. I run Queerly Yours with my girlfriend Angela, who's also one of the folks I play games with and who helps me test things. But yeah, our podcast is actually not primarily game design. We keep saying we should start another podcast too, but there's only so many I can run at once, potentially sometime in future. But yeah, our podcast is a relationship advice show. And we try to talk about the sort of many dimensions that relationships have in folks' lives, so not just romantic partners, but family and friends and community members. And because we're also both game design nerds, one of our episodes is called RPGs and Relationships, and it's about how we think about games from relational perspectives and what happens when you're playing games with folks that you're connected to in other ways, and how the folks we play games with are community groups and are part of our important social circles. So if you are looking for advice or interested in hearing some nerds' thoughts about the sort of sociocultural dimensions of what it means to be in game communities as players and designers, you can check out our RPGs and Relationships episode.
Awesome. I think I'm going to check that one out. How did you get into podcasting in the first place?
A lot of it was just listening to a ton of podcasts and really enjoying that experience and feeling like I was feeling more familiar with the medium and figuring out what I enjoyed listening to. And then also, as I mentioned, my background is primarily in education, and I primarily worked in environmental education, but another core facet that's been important to me is doing LGBTQ, like peer mentorship and support and youth advocacy, and I've also worked in sexual and relationship health education formats. So that was a skill set and background that I had that I really wanted to share. I also really love advice bloggers. I really, really, really love advice bloggers. When I was in my teens, I used to hang out on Yahoo Answers and answer other stressed out teens questions about like relationships and sexual health. So just a lot of time hanging out there going, you can't get pregnant from that. You can't get pregnant from that. You can't get pregnant from that. Dump your boyfriend. Dump your boyfriend. You can't get pregnant from that. I can't diagnose you over the internet. You probably could get pregnant from that, but I can't tell you. Dump your boyfriend. Other advice too, but those were honestly two very common ones. So then kind of the more podcasts I listened to, the more I realized this is a format where I could do this kind of like advice and resource discussion in a way that would be relatively easy to set up and share with people. And it would teach me audio editing, which was a skill set that I wanted to learn out of general interest, and also the fact that I love music and want to have it as a resource for there too. And as I mentioned earlier, my girlfriend loves voice acting. And so we sort of communally, I pitched it to her, and we decided that it would be cool to have a format where she could get to do some vocal work and really create more of a portfolio of her voice. I could learn audio editing, and we're a long distance couple who love talking and thinking about relationship dynamics. And so it would give us a format for intentionally sitting down with each other at least a couple of times a month over the internet and digging in really deep to some piece of relationship advice that we find important and something that we want to share with others. And it's become a lot bigger than we thought it was going to. We did our most recent episode that we put out there was what we're calling our first community forum, where we posed a question to the internet and got sort of advice and input from just people out in the world through our Facebook friends and through a podcasting group on Facebook. And we asked folks what kind of relationship advice they wish they could go back in time and give their teenage selves. People got real deep into it. We got so many cool thoughts and pieces of advice and answers. Some of them were really sad and bittersweet. Some of them were charming. A lot of them, I think, because of our friend circle, like, you're a lot more gay and trans than you realize you are now, and it's going to be okay. But it might be more okay if you recognize this earlier and work on processing that. But it was all really, really sweet and charming. And we had a really good time with that. So yeah, I kind of got into podcasting because I knew it was sort of a medium that I enjoyed, and I wanted to learn more about it. And I felt like that we had something that we could share. And so far that seemed like it's been the case. We've got a small circle of folks who enjoy listening to it. And it also gives us format for talking about things that we want to talk about, because we're the bosses of it. So if we want to make an episode of the Relationship Advice podcast about RPGs, we can do that. We're the ones who make it. No one can tell us not to.
That's a good point. What has your experience as a podcaster been like?
It's been a lot of work. I feel like I'm really grateful for all the people, again, much like with tabletop game design, I'm grateful for how many folks talk about their process and their experience making podcasts online, because I had so many how-to guides and resources to draw on for learning audio editing, structuring and pacing things, for finding the right sort of tech and logistical setups, and also for doing all of this for relatively cheap, not counting time, because it does take a lot of time. And so I'm very grateful for essentially one of the key first things we did, which was we did not start releasing episodes until we had built up an episode buffer. And we've run that buffer all the way down several times since then, but we keep trying to build it back up again. And that's also why we release every other week, because on a certain level it'd be cool to release weekly, but I physically can't edit things that fast on top of the schedule of things that I already have. But because there was so much cool advice out there online, I had a lot of resources to draw from and figuring out how long things were likely to take. And so I started from a pretty conservative basis in terms of imagining what would be possible to do. And I feel like now, as I get more familiar with yeah. I was going to but it seems like people are, and we're hoping in the future to build off in more formats. We want to do community forums again, pose questions to the internet about relationships and sort of catalog and go through people's answers. And we'd also love to do some interviews on it in future too. Bring in other folks to share their perspectives on relationships, because we're not ultimate experts. We're just two people who like talking. But I am impressed by how welcoming and cool so many podcasting community spaces have been. I also got to attend PodCon 2 in Seattle recently, and that was just such a blast. Like, it was one of the friendliest convention experiences I've ever been at. Everyone just was so hyped to talk, which I guess is not surprising in a genre based around talking and then sharing it with the internet. But it just was really, really lovely. I feel like I got from folks there too, and that people were really open and welcoming with sharing ideas, with sharing feedback, with supporting each other's premises. I got to help people produce ideas and things for their podcasts at the event. Like, one table for a paranormal show, like, they had little worksheets and you could design your own cryptid, and then they were going to take back a stack of original, like, weird paranormal creatures with them that they could potentially use in their show and credit people for. So there were just all kinds of those little weird creative things, and that really charmed me too. I liked the energy of it.
That's cool. I hadn't heard of PodcastCon, but I guess that makes sense. That makes sense. It's yeah. I think we're really getting to a point where if there's a big community, you can find a convention for it now.
Yeah, I know there's at least one other, like, podcasting convention thing, because I keep seeing, like, Facebook keeps trying to advertise it to me since I attended one podcast convention. But yeah, there's not a ton of them yet, and they're still pretty new and sparse on the ground, but it's a cool format. And I think it's an interesting one in that it was definitely a space where a really huge percentage of the attendees were also creators, because podcasting is not inherently easy. It's still a huge amount of work, and I feel like I don't want to describe the barrier to entry as though it doesn't exist. Just because something is cheap and you don't have to put money into it to do it doesn't mean it doesn't take a huge amount of time and energy. But it is, relative to some other forms of media, a lot easier to start a podcast than to suddenly run a theater production or start a TV show or things. So you get a really cool range of folks trying out to see what it's like to podcast and sharing a range of perspectives and creative approaches.
Okay. I think that's a pretty good perspective. How long have you been a content creator?
Ooh, content creator makes it an even bigger term. I mean, do you count, like, having a DeviantArt in high school?
I would. That's that's first experiences, and you learn a lot, even from...
Yeah. That was kind of my first online creative space. No, actually, take it back. First, no, I guess they sort of happened in parallel. I was also on Gaia Online, which I think still technically exists, but only kind of. That was a site where I think I did my first art commissions for people, but, like, for the in-game currency, not for money. But yeah, I mean, when I was younger, I did a lot more visual art and a lot more drawing, and that's something I'd like to get more back into. But I found for, like, this sort of energy and structural budget of my life right now, I can talk basically whenever. I can talk until my voice gives out. I can talk if I'm half asleep. I can talk if I'm sick. I'm much less capable of drawing when I'm at partial capacity, but I can talk and produce things around that a lot more smoothly, and I can write a lot more smoothly even in those cases. So game design and podcasting are easier things to keep going even when I'm feeling overwhelmed on other fronts in my life. But yeah, the arc has been kind of initially a lot more writing and visual art, and then over time it's moved more towards music, podcasting, and now game design. But yeah, since my teens at the very least is when I started sharing it. And I think at my parents' house, my dad does wire crafts, and I think there's some wire mobiles made based on art I drew as a toddler. So if you want to go all the way back to the originals, I did some art collabs at around age 4. Never really stopped.
That's really cute. What has your journey as a content creator been like?
Calling it a journey is kind of a fun way to frame it. I'm trying to think of elements of that to elaborate on that haven't been covered in the other arcs of this question. I feel like when I was in my teens, it was a lot more just I drew and I wrote songs because that was a really important emotional expressive outlet, and I would have been doing it even if there was no place for me to share it with anyone. Those were emotional processing tools. They were also art, but at their core, even at the time, I was thinking of and acknowledging them very much as being emotional processing tools, ways that I could put my feelings in a format where I could look at them and reflect on them and get more of a sense of what they were. So I drew a lot of personal narrative stuff. I wrote a lot of personal narrative songs, and I also did a lot of gender-bent art of my entire high school friend group, which now I look back on and I'm like, yeah, I was really trans. I still am. I didn't know that was what was going on, but I sure spent a lot of time doing art that dug into all the social and cultural differences that would have happened to me and my friends if we'd been assigned differently at birth. That was like my core ongoing like narrative art project throughout high school. So that's still an interesting one to look back on. So I feel like initially it was very much my art was for me and for my closest friends and for maybe a couple people I met on the internet. And I feel like where I'm at now, I still really love the art I create, but I definitely get a lot more caught in the loop of thinking of it as content that I'm creating. And processing it differently because of that, thinking of it less as, is this something that I'm making because it's doing something emotionally useful for me, versus is this something I'm making because if I put it out into the world, it will be able to support me in some way, socially or financially or both. And I'm trying to create more of a balance with that. I feel pretty good about where Queerly Yours is with that, because we didn't really think people would listen to it when we started it. So that wasn't a big motivator for starting. It was mainly an excuse for us to really dig into conversations we to be having. And so I'm trying to still keep that central to how we approach it. Not that we don't want it to be a podcast that people enjoy, but that if what people have enjoyed so far is us focusing on what we want to talk about, then there's no reason to not keep focusing on what we want to talk about and bringing that enthusiasm into what we're doing. But yeah, I feel like the journey has been, I sort of just became kind of an accidental freelancer on a lot of fronts. Also, both of my parents are self-employed and have run multiple businesses that they founded throughout the course of my childhood. So they've always been good resources on that, and they are the folks who got me some of my first like real world like art commission projects working for specific people, or writing projects working for specific people, and gave me a sense that that was something that I could do and that there were good tools and formats for approaching that as an actual like work project that I could make and that I could share with others. So that helped me a lot. That gave me a lot of a foundational sense of how I wanted to approach that.
Okay. What have been some of your highlights and lowlights throughout your time doing podcasts and creating content for tabletop role-playing games?
Oh, that's a lovely question. There's a lot of them. I mean, highlights for the podcast, it's still a pretty young show, but the response we got when we put the question, what relationship advice would you give your teenage self? That was just such a deep delight, because we posted it in 2 different places, and between the 2 of them we got over 70 responses, and some of them were multi-paragraph, like reflective essays about people's teen experiences. People shared some really sweet, thoughtful, intimate stuff with us about their life experiences, and then we had to go through and sort it all and sort of try to organize it into a way where we could talk about it. But that was delightful to realize, oh, we're talking about things that people are really grateful to have a format to talk about, and it takes very little prompting to open up a space where folks want to share that because they're looking for a chance to share that. Like people I did not know, people who just knew that I was someone else in a podcasting group with them, were telling me about some of the roughest moments in their teen years, and I'm really grateful for that. And I did not know that was going to happen, but it rocked my socks off. In tabletop game design, there's a lot of cool things to that too. One of the initial highlights, I mentioned that my first game that I wrote, Pocket Magic, was for the 200-word RPG competition. I was also a reviewer for the 200-word RPG competition because they've started getting so many submissions to that game competition that the judges can't read every game. So volunteer review teams each get sent, I forget exactly how many they send us, but you get sent something between 60 and 80 of these tiny games, and all of the information about who wrote them has been scrubbed. And you have to go through and read all of them and then submit your top 5. And selections from out of these reviewers groups are what go on to the judges. And reading those few dozen games and really going through them in detail was really early on in my sort of experience of doing game design. And I'm so grateful to everyone who wrote games for that competition and for the chance to do that review work, because it made me think in so many new ways about what a game can be. There was a game written in iambic pentameter. You know, there were games that had really cool and strange and weird uses of like symbol and verbal structure and really novel game mechanics, things that use physical space, things emotional response. And I had so much trouble paring down to that final 5 I had to send in. I ended up making my own rating code for the different things I was experiencing while reading them. Like, here's the little symbol. I'll draw a gear if the game had a really novel mechanic I'd never seen. I'm going to draw a teardrop if I had an emotive response while reading the game. I'm going to draw a little scroll of parchment if it had just really beautiful flowing writing that stood out to me. But it was like having this wildly amazing sampler platter of what a game can look like and how many different things a tabletop game can look like. So that was just, it was a really hard experience to have to rate and pare down to 5 games. But it was also a really beautiful kind of learning experience and window into the bare bones of game design, like what people choose to put in a game when they're only allowed to have 200 words to make one. So there's a lot of things I could pull out as highlights, but that was kind of an early one that kickstarted me into wanting to continue into the game design space.
It sounds like a really interesting exercise in the first place, too. Like, I can't
really
imagine trying to write a game in 200 words. I get in trouble on Discord sending a message because I passed 2,000 regularly.
That's part of why I did it, was because I have trouble writing short things, and so I became sort of ornery about it. It's like, well, I have to write a 200-word one now to show that I can. I need to face that challenge and rise to it. But yeah, in the 200-word games, like if you search 200-word RPG, all the past years, all of the games, every possible submission, they're all available for free online. And the finalists and the winners are in their own subcategory. And they're all over the place. I want to play so many of them. And there's hundreds, you know, you could play one of them every day for the rest. Probably not for the rest of your life. I'm probably wildly miscalculating the math, but you could play one every day for years and you run out.
Well, if there's hundreds, depending on how much time a person has.
Exactly.
That gets dark. We'll leave that alone.
That's true, yeah, I didn't go down that path. Well, some of the games are very dark too, to be honest. Like, there's some pretty gnarly ones out there, and also some amazingly, you get a real mood and style range when people have to pare things down to a tiny amount of words as well. There's one about becoming a dragon that I really liked. You're like in an interview process because you're going to become a dragon, and that one can be pretty darn goofy. But then there's also ones that are like, we're going to go deep into the psyche in 200 words here. Are you ready? And I'm like, I might not be ready, but I'm very interested in this.
I could see that, yeah, because, ooh, yeah. Dives into the psyche, or they're a thing. A game that does that, yeah, that's a thing.
There's definitely quite a lot about the world ending. And I mean, I like games about the world ending as much as the next person. That's not actually a good phrase. I don't know how many people like games about the world ending, but I like them. But if you have to read dozens and dozens of them, you learn mechanically interesting things, and sometimes you also decide, it seems like some people just really wanted to write a very sad game, and that's cool, but they were very one note in their approach to it sometimes.
Sometimes people just want to watch the world burn.
Very much.
What systems have you played, and what have been your favorite out of them?
Oh my god, so many. Somewhere back on my Twitter, someone posted something that was about, you know, how many, like, what game systems have you played in 2018? Like, they were posting around the new year, and I started to lose track because I play all these very small games in one-shot formats. But there's a lot that I like. I've sort of arced in different ones that I've enjoyed over the years. Sort of staples that I've played one-shots of a lot are Fiasco, Microscope, Monster Hearts, Downfall. There's definitely others that I'm forgetting. There's a few that I still haven't played but really want to. I still have yet to play The Quiet Year or Magic, and people keep telling me I need to, and I keep saying I want to. It's just a matter of finding the precise moment when there's the right circle of people available to play them with. One of my favorite game systems I've gotten into lately is Scum and Villainy. It got recommended to me by multiple people when I asked them, what's a good game for being space pirates? And everyone said Scum and Villainy. And so I said, well, that was a really thorough and consistent answer. I better go see what this is. And I really enjoyed that one. Both, I like the way it writes suggestions and sort of encouragements and guidelines for players and for game masters, because it really focuses on the fact that your characters are all daring space criminals. Like, they're inherently at least a little bit good at their jobs. So it encourages you to not nitpick or overthink. Do you have exactly the skills or the toolkits to attempt this? It's like, no, be bold. You're playing characters that do daring space crime. They are daring people. Dive into the situation, even if it has high stakes. Take a little risk. That will help drive the narrative. Have fun with that. And the way that's built into the game and the way that it's mechanically encouraged, I think is really lovely. Because it's based in part on Blades in the Dark. So your character's vices, the things that may complicate their lives, you're sort of encouraged to mechanically incorporate. And if you do it in narratively interesting and rich ways, that gets you other in-game benefits, but it also means that things might backfire on you. And it also has a really lovely system in meshing the characters into a complicated world during character creation. The ship that they fly in is almost a character of its own. It has its own very detailed informational sheet. And as the crew decide on sort of modifications and additions to the ship, as the game master, you get to ask them, so how did you acquire that piece of material? Did you buy it outright? Did you steal it from someone, or did you owe someone for it? And they get to decide how they got it, and then you get to tell them if they chose to steal it, or to buy it, or to owe someone for it. Who are they connected to through that? And so then suddenly this crew of space pirates, has a long-standing trade partnership with, the sort of outlaw engineering group, and they've stole all of their false paperwork from like a spy organization. So it's really good paperwork, but a spy organization is hunting them down, and they owe a debt to a crime boss on a remote ice planet, and suddenly they're enmeshed. You have so many directions you can go, and you have all these strings that you can pull to help create entertaining plot, and everyone is inherently bought into it because they decided how they were going to build that ship, what kinds of things they wanted to implicate themselves in as characters and as players. So there's a lot of systems I enjoy, but that's one that lately I keep coming back to a lot when I'm thinking about how to create game mechanics that really support interesting and engaging gameplay, and also game manuals that really talk about tone and what kind of mood and energy the characters in the game are going to have, and how to lean into that play perspective.
Okay. What kind of things do you do as a player and as a GM to prep for yourself for a game?
It varies a lot based on game. Lately, I do less and less because I'm very tired and I do a lot of different projects. Often what I'll do is just have some like sort of keynotes in a brainstorm sheet. If I'm going to be playing something in running something in an ongoing campaign for folks, make notes of like what are some key events or places that I want them to get to, or things that are going to happen in game in some ways that I know what to sort of guide the story towards. And I'll also take a few notes at the end of each session about what are the main story beats that happen, that I have them to review. When I'm playing in a lot of one-shots, I just arrive really excited and with an open vision for it, because in a lot of GM-less games, nothing is going to be decided until I get there. And so the main thing to arrive with is, I've had snacks, I'm well hydrated, I'm feeling social, I'm prepared to really dig into this with other people. And often in that case, I feel like the sort of prep process is more like the start of game, when you're collaborating with other people to build out characters in the game world. And in that, I try to focus on thinking about what will be fun for me, and also asking questions of the other players. Like, I think it would be fun maybe if our characters were connected in this way. How does that sound to you? Or I think this premise could be interesting. Does that work for you? It's a totally take it or leave it thing. Because I feel like, especially in one-shot games, sometimes people freeze up and they get in a polite place where they don't want to contribute ideas because they don't want to get in the way of someone else's idea. Which is sweet, but then sometimes you get the awkward silence of no one being totally sure what they want to add to it. So I feel like my default has become, I have this idea. If it sounds interesting to you, let's roll with it. I'm not married to it. Like, I will not be mad if we don't use it, but here's something I'm putting on the table, so we have something on the table. And let's see if we can play off of it from there. And there have been only a couple times where I've gotten to be on game streams, but for that, I try to think about, especially sort of, what's my character like socially? Because I know for that, one of the main factors is going to be interacting with other people on stream. and trying to create a flow of dialogue and action that feels fun. And I know I'm a chatty person, so I try to incorporate that into characters in some ways, but sometimes I'll try to make characters that are quieter than me, at least as a slight challenge, to help me pay attention to what kind of breathing room I'm creating in a game space. But generally, if a character is prepped ahead of time, I want key things that the character wants and the sort of social energy they tend to approach the world with, so that I have something to riff off of. And if I'm GMing, it's honestly all over the place depending on the system, but if I've got anything down, it is key story beats and reviewing notes from whatever the last game was, so that I have a sense of how I want things to flow and that I can remind everyone of where we're at if we lost track of.
Sounds pretty good. I think now would probably be a good time for us to go ahead and take a break. So we will be back shortly. Because I didn't do the button. Welcome back, guys. My name's Torn Pixie, and this is the RPG Unlimited podcast. We are talking with Naomi about her experiences as a RPG. Thank you. As as a content creator and a developer for RPGs. So yeah, I think, where were we?
We've gone in a lot of different places. I've given you probably an even more exhaustive history of how I got into RPGs that is necessary, but I did have fun talking about it. Yeah, we've talked a lot about tiny games too, like writing very short games and games for game jams and other sort of limited formats, and theater and podcasts, and definitely other things I'm forgetting.
Yep, a lot of stuff. Well, I mean, there's a lot that you've done and a lot of stuff you have experience with, so that's a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's how I try to frame it for myself too.
What has your experience specifically as a GM been like?
That's been an interesting one because definitely I feel like it's very much divided in my head in ways that relate to getting my master's degree in education. Because the first time I attempted to facilitate a game on my own, it was the game Dream Askew, which is GM-less, but it still helps to have a facilitator. You read the game and is more familiar with it. But it's designed to be a game where everyone is playing both one character and one aspect of the world. So you're sort of co-designing as you go. And my players had fun with it. I got really cranky and weird while attempting to facilitate it, because I realize now, looking back at 20-year-old me attempting to run a game, and I realize I had all kinds of assumptions about what I would be able to control about the game space that then were not true at all. And I didn't open myself up to that. Instead, I just got really cranky about that. But then over time, I really got more into actually actively and running games after I was also doing much more of a deep dive into learning about like educational theory and practice. And especially one of my favorite classes I got to take in my master's program was called Classroom Discourse. And it was essentially about the ways that people communicate in educational spaces. Like, how do you communicate ideas to your students? How do you help support students in understanding and listening to each other and collaborating with each other? What kinds of dynamics and structures of power happen in educational spaces? And one of the other grad students in that class was also someone who was really into tabletop games. There was a sort of whole subcluster of that class who were really into tabletop games. And unsurprisingly, classroom discourse was a class where there were really great classroom discussions. The teacher was really, really good at facilitating those in interesting ways. And so she had us do a lot of different kinds of activities. We'd often be in small groups and doing different kinds of movement or drawing or different projects. And there was, I don't even remember what the key topic was, but there was one occasion where one of these groups, mini groups in our class, when we were all drawing representations of what we'd talked about in our small group discussions, one of the groups essentially drew a D&D session to represent the concepts that they'd been talking about in terms of how to explore these educational principles and how to communicate with people in a collaborative group space. And so it ended up being like this small subgroup of the class trying to sort of describe how tabletop games work to all these other education grad students who had not played tabletop games, which was very goofy and fun and weird at the time. And I feel like that's not the only thing that affected it, but that's an anchor for me in thinking about how my approach to GMing things has changed, because a lot of the tools that you use for teaching outdoor education to fifth graders in the woods are the same as the tools that you use for running a one-shot for strangers. Because a lot of the core premises are, hey, people who don't know me very well, I'm going to be in charge of facilitating an interesting experience for you today. I need to make sure we all know who everyone is, that we all know what our needs are in this space, that we all know sort of what we owe each other in this space, the ways that we're going to be accountable to each other and respect each other. We need to have a community agreement about how this is going to work, and we also need to know what it is, how long it's going to be, what kind of themes and content it's going to be. And now that I've set that up, now we can do this cool activity together. And whether that activity is a hike down to a beach where we're going to, look at cool crabs and go tide pooling, whether it's going to be telling a collaborative story for about 3 hours with people that I may have never met before, a lot of that toolkit is the same. It's getting a sense of familiarity, of comfort, of figuring out what the sort of structural and social rules of the space are, so that if something gets weird or awkward, confusing, whether it is someone being upset, someone disrespecting someone else, or just a rule or a concept not being clear, that at the very start, I have worked to lay out a foundation of shared knowledge about what we will do if something doesn't make sense, or what we will do if something isn't working for us. And learning about educational pedagogy and child development really helped me understand how key a lot of that is, but a lot of it is super not limited to just working with kids. The other thing for me is I'm really chatty and excitable, and I have a lot of ideas, and I love sharing my thoughts, and so I don't often pause when I talk. And one of the key things that I was essentially pushed very hard to do by my mentors, and it was very appropriate that they pushed me during my education program, was if I ask a question, I have to count in my head to at least 3, preferably 5, before I say anything else, much less expect anyone to come up with an answer. You need to leave wait time. You need to create space. People don't have enough time and room in their brains to respond to your ideas. And that alone, even if I hadn't learned anything else in grad school, though I'd like to think I learned other things, that alone radically changed how I approached game facilitation, because it pushed me to think so much more, not just about, am I getting the ideas out there? Am I crafting a good world? Am I creating space? Is there enough space for the other people in this experience to be having a good experience and to be adding their own contributions to the space? And I could ramble a lot about educational pedagogy in this. I have a whole essay that I wrote on it. But that honestly is kind of the big dividing point vision of how I run games. Even if I haven't done any other prep for games, I try to enter game facilitation spaces with as much focus and energy as I would if I was in charge of 12 fifth graders in the woods. When I do that, games tend to work pretty well. I won't say it's a guarantee, but if I can bring that kind of energy and those tools that I know, it puts me in a way more grounded and comfortable place to work.
Sounds like a good way to go about it, especially when you consider how things can work with groups sometimes, especially when there are new people and new dynamics, and how it is very much like going into a new classroom. So.
Exactly. Like, group management tools super cross-apply. If there was anything that I would love to just try to gift out to more GMs and DMs in general, a lot of classroom management tools. And not the ones that are about, get the children to be still, but about, get the children to engage thoughtfully. Those ones, if you have some of those in your toolkit, it really expands what you can do. And I feel like helps you feel less lost when you're running games. Like, oh, I don't know how to handle this situation or how to control this situation. It both helps you figure out how to control some things and also how to know when it's really cool that you're not controlling the thing and you don't need to hold on to a vision that you can or that you should.
Would you say the inverse side of one of the big things in classrooms is how to get everyone to hold still would be how to encourage them to get up and move and actually, really pull like every bit of a character?
Yeah, getting folks to engage is definitely really big, especially if you've got, variety in how familiar people particular game system or how familiar they are with playing a tabletop game. And also just personality wise, some people are having a fun time if they're not that much in game, but it's good to be aware of those dynamics and how they're happening. And yeah, I think again that's another thing where there are some tools in educational formats that can do that, and some of those are ones that I also do see in game spaces. I personally really like game books and guides that have little written out examples of play in them. Even if sometimes they're a little bit cheesy, I really enjoy those little see an example of what a scene might look or sound like. And I also, a lot of Powered by the Apocalypse games have this, though it's certainly not exclusive to them. Games where they'll give you sort of key descriptive words or adjectives to use as anchor points for a character, or also key questions for the game facilitator to ask to move play forward, or sometimes even things like sentence starters to suggest the kinds of things you might do. And I enjoy those because I feel like those often form really charming parallels with teaching tools in terms of like how to ask questions that will foster good classroom dialogue. I feel like there's sometimes like a very sweet stylistic overlap between those and some of the kinds of question lists that you see in some game guides to help game masters figure out what can I ask my players that will help them engage with the world, find creative ways to be involved in it if they're not sure how to start from scratch.
I think that could be really important. I know a lot of times creating your first character or doing a new game where character creation's a lot different, figuring out a good place to start could be really difficult for some people. So the GM having those kind of tools available, that can help so much, because it's like, all right, so I think I might have this idea, but maybe this thing doesn't fit. Here's this thing that might help me figure it out, though.
I like to times when, especially if it's a game where you have one main game master facilitator and playing characters that are in some kind of connected party, I like systems that help you enmesh your characters in useful ways. And I think sometimes it almost becomes almost too much cognitive load, though sometimes that can be fun in its own way. I have definitely played fiasco games where there were so many different ways that our characters had debts or grudges or intimate connections with other characters that we ended up having to draw a little diagram on the table with a lot of lines tracking, who was whose ex and who had stolen from who and all of those different things. But it also gave us a lot of plot hooks, and if something got too complicated, we just kind of let ourselves forget about or ignore it. But we weren't hurting for figuring out ways that we could connect our characters. So I like games that do that too. I also feel like sometimes, and again, comes back to some educational strategies, you don't need to give people a ton of choices always. Sometimes it's nice to pare it down. Like when you're working with students, it's often like, give them two options where you're cool with both options. Which of these two pieces of music are we going to work on practicing now? Not, are we going to practice music or play a word game, but which piece do you want to start with? And with players, I feel like sometimes you can narrow down the formats for like, here's a couple different ways your group could already know each other. Which of these sounds like the more appealing narrative? But either way, you're having to agree that your characters are already co-invested in the thing. So you're going to approach it from that character perspective. Please play these characters as people who have at least some fraction of common goal so that there are ways for us to move the story forward together.
Would you say that's a really important piece to games that is underutilized?
I don't feel like it's necessarily underutilized, but I feel like not everyone necessarily puts that at the front or thinks about how it can smooth out the flow of games when they're not sure how to create good collaborative story experiences. And again, like some games too, you can create games that are competitive between players, and that's not inherent. It's a different format, and still in a way it's a collaboration. Even if the characters are opposed, they're still collaborating to create the story that you are building together through gameplay. I feel like it's a thing that where I'm glad when it's in game guides. When it's not in game guides, I try to think about how I could bring that into it if it's relevant to the story. And I feel like I'm often a little more relaxed if I know I have some kind of element like that. The most like bare bones example is the first time I ever ran D&D. It was for my cousins, and I didn't want to limit them very much in their character creation, but then I had to acknowledge that they were probably going to bring a really wild range of characters that would not necessarily have a simple way for me to tie them together. And so the way I did it was, you're all arriving at this town because there's going to be a huge festival here, and they're encouraging people to come in from out of town to help with different work for hire projects. Like almost every skill set is needed. If you can do magic, if you can heal, if you can perform, and also if you are a rogue and say like stealing from people, a huge festival is a great place to do that. So you're all at this town for your own personal reasons, and you all need some money. There is only one job left on the like work for hire listing for the day in the tavern, and it just says frog. So you are all standing there looking at the sheet, and you're confused, and you need to figure out what is this job and how can you get it, because you all need the money. And then they were all fighting a giant frog together. But I didn't give them a lot of choices. I'm like, you're all here because it's easy to have a reason to be in this town. Here's your collaborative buy-in. You're all going to go do this. And they were all happy. They wanted a cool thing to be pointed towards. And so I pointed them towards the giant frog, and they went the giant. Depending on the kind of players I have and the kind of story structure of the game, it might be more than that. But at the core level, it was that kind of thing. I wanted it to be narratively smooth for them to imagine that their characters would end up in the same place, would want to be in the same place, would have shared.
One of the things I know that I've had a couple GMs ask that I think could be more widely used, and I think it kind of ties in pretty close, is character motivations, which is very different from having a personality, ideals, and bonds. It's like, what is your character's actual goal? Regardless of what the campaign is, what do they want to accomplish in their life? Like, you don't have to do like a 5-year plan for your character, right? But what makes them tick?
Yeah, I feel like that can be a lot of fun, and it's, I think, also just nice to remember that there are so many different ways you can activate that energy. Like, I could put a distinct plot thing in front of my characters that will pull them together. We can incorporate their personal goals and motivations. We can think about the world building and what sort of shared structures of this whole land or space that they're in might draw people together. And having a sort of multivariate toolkit that all help you support flow and smoothness and enjoyment and sort of lower the potential for the narrative clunkiness of like, why are we collaborating on this, is nice. And of course, we're both talking about it largely from the GM perspective. Characters and players are part of this too. Like, if your players don't want to collaborate, you can't really force them to in very many useful ways if they super don't want to. And that's one of the reasons that I appreciate Scum and Villainy doing things like having tips for players about how to play generously in ways that work well with the form and structure of the game, and encourage them to do things like enact your vices, take risks. You're playing a daring space criminal. Don't worry about holding back. You can dive into this world and you will be rewarded with cool stories, even if you're in danger along the way. It's okay to put your character in danger. They are designed to be the kind of character who ends up in danger sometimes. Dive towards that, enjoy that. That will create good plot wheels turning for everyone. That will create fun moments. But I like it because also sometimes if I'm tired or frustrated with my players, I can go, let's refer to the player tips. If I'm feeling like we're not totally sure where we want to go right now, let's remember that thing I linked to that I specifically said I wanted you all to read. Be kind to me. Please remember the player tips too. I may be the GM, but even if when I'm playing games with a game master, I try to lean more in the direction of being a facilitator and create at least some chances for the players to inform the world. And I want them to think of themselves as people who are informed, at least through their actions, if not distinct narrative power beyond that.
That actually kind of reminds me of a discussion recently on Twitter within the tabletop role-playing community. And that is whether or not GMs are players or if they are completely, distinctly a different thing.
Oh gosh, I saw that one, yeah. That's been going all over the place. I'm trying to remember who posted it. Someone was talking about how they actually made, to tie back to the theater thing, I saw someone make a parallel where they think the best way to think of the GM is as a director. Not that they're not deeply, deeply involved in the story, but that they're helping shape it in some useful and positive ways. And like, it's not necessarily the same thing as being a, but they're part of the theater production. They are still there. They're still part of the crew in many key important ways. So like, yes, a player, but like a player that is trying to create a fun narrative shape for things and also collaborate with the other players, because a director doesn't just tell all the actors to do a thing and then expect them to follow it to the letter. They want to work with the styles and approaches of the actors to engage with the play and make it a really distinct vital production in a way that couldn't happen with other actors.
I think that's a pretty good analogy there too. I know for me, I was definitely one of those, hey, I'm a player too. Just absolutely, because I do same. All these other things on the side, I've got these characters, and there are a few people that are like, well, it's easy to play to an archetype. It's like, you're making it a very, very wild assumption that everyone's just creating characters with no experience off of archetypes. Like, nope.
Yeah, part of the beauty of being a game master is that when you create characters for the other players to interact with, is that you can add so much responsive nuance and dimension to them in a way that's different from like a pre-programmed shopkeep in a video game. Like, you can create response arcs that you could not predict out of how the players respond to and work with the characters that you're building for them to interact with. Like, that's part of what's cool about it. And that is a form of play. Also, I think world building is a form of play. I think even in situations where I'm not controlling any characters, I still think that's play. That's stuff that I did for fun as a kid. I'm doing it now because it's still fun. And it's a way to play and interact with my friends.
Yeah. Especially with the world building, if you don't go collaborative with that, your players can have a lot of stuff to help build a world. At that point, that same argument, are they no longer players, or are we a bunch of DMs DMing a game together? Is that what we're doing then?
Yeah, I like that sort of cross-directional approach to the logic of it. Because my D&D campaign were like sort of semi-unintentionally on hiatus because of scheduling, but all the players wrote really detailed, lovely backstories for their characters. And part of me was like, oh god, this is so cool, I'm so excited they built this. And part of me was like, oh god, how am I ever going to fit this into the story? And so there are parts of it we haven't engaged with that deeply, but kind of what's happened through the combo of that and my pre-existing world building, and then now the fusion of those two things through play, and through them adding details throughout the process and me adding details throughout the process, is that something none of us could have totally predicted happened, which is that even though they all designed characters from very different backgrounds and life experiences, it's becoming the story of like this ragtag band of people bonded by exile. Like, each of them has been outcast from a different place for different reasons. And because of that, it's almost like putting them in a place of planar resonance, where they keep getting put in situations where they're crossing boundaries between the material plane and other planes, because they're all like almost emotively, magically more in tune with feeling out of place. And that's affecting what kind of magic is drawn to them, and also what situations I think in. And like, I think that's play, and two, they designed most of that. The flow.
That sounds really, really cool. Kind of reminds me of how with our current group for my Sunday games, one of the things that recently came out is almost everyone there is orphaned, and the one person that is orphaned might as well be because things went wrong with the teleportation and she landed in a place not where it was intended, and has no idea about where her family landed at the same time. So it's a very, very, it's an interesting parallel there on that.
There's a lot. And I feel like that's a thing where on some fronts, that's also the kind of narrative that, especially in a game like D&D, it's easy to roll with, because it helps explain why you would have a character who is a wandering adventurer. If they're in some way displaced or disconnected, if they don't have an easy, cozy home, then it's easy to let them wander through a story. But it's interesting, I feel like different player groups can do such different things with that. I mean, murder hobo, like, I don't love the phrase, but it is a classic trope of characters who are just wandering because they want to stab things and collect loot. And what I've got right now is a group of people who are wandering And in the process, I think they are actually sort of semi-unintentionally ending up fomenting a revolution of fellow exiles, who are probably going to go like retake the Underdark from its like overwhelming bureaucracy. Because I redesigned the entire Underdark, and it's sort of because of other factors in my world. And one of my characters wanted to be a political exile from it, and so he designed most of the Underdark politics to explain why he was exiled. And now he keeps meeting other exiles on the surface because he decided that we sort of
very much
you banish all the dissenters to the surface. And they share political strategies. So yeah, initially I think I had different visions for the end quest, but it's entirely possible that if we get back into game, like one of the dramatic moments will be them figuring out how to how to create political upheaval in the Underdark. And I'm happy about that.
That's another interesting parallel. We came in and we decided fairly quickly after experiencing some stuff with this particular cult that we were going to take it upon ourselves to eradicate this cult. And now it snowballed and we ran into this other large gang and we're like, all right, we're going to eradicate that too. And oh God, some of us, I think we've got some like definitive shifts from maybe we aren't so much neutral or chaotic to where it's like, oh hey, look at what we keep doing. But then again, we're not even thinking about consequences for a lot of it. We're like, we're gonna do this thing because this thing over here is not okay.
That's sweet. That's a nice way to be sort of barreling through situations. Oh no, we developed more. We can't let these things stand, so we have to dive into interesting, dangerous situations. It's a fun way to create gameplay.
Yeah. Should be careful with what I say though, because my DM's gonna get ideas and do things with it.
Yeah, I'm trying not to say too much. Like, we're on a long enough hiatus that I'm not too worried about like accidentally revealing anything, because I know I'll keep making things up as we go, and so will they. But I like that process. And yeah, the other thing, this is actually something I'd kind of love to hear your. That group of players, both games I play with them, D&D and Scum and Villainy, none of them ever play humans. They're all of the solid opinion of, why on earth would I ever play a human in a fantasy world? I'm a human all the time anyway. So in D&D, that's pretty simple to do. In Scum and Villainy, it's actually a little bit less encouraged. There are technically non-humans, but they're rarer. Like the Xenos, the alien species, are more scattered. But they created an all-Xeno spaceship crew, and they're all a different type of alien from each other, too. So it's a really weirdly modded out ship, because it's piloted by someone who has 2 thumbs per hand, and most of their sensory perception is smell-based. So, like, no one else can pilot all the controls. But I'm curious, like, if that's something that you've run into or talked about in other game spaces, like, how do you feel about playing humans in fantasy and sci-fi worlds? How has that come up in your game spaces? Because I have had these ongoing experiences of players who essentially can't imagine why anyone is human.
I've actually experienced one campaign where the DM was like, all right, here are the races you could be. And there were a couple exceptions for a couple players that we found out later, but it wasn't stuff we were aware of. It was bloodline stuff that we found out about later in the game. And we all had to be humans. And not only were we humans, we were human children starting out, running away from this plague that's overtaking the world. It's, and we've got these warrior elves that come in and whisk us away, and some of us are sitting there running, and as we're running, our sibling falls and we lose our sibling. Like, very emotional start to that. And I think it is very much for most people, we are humans in our day-to-day. Why would we play that? Why wouldn't we play something different? But then when you consider the worlds, it's interesting. Specifically with D&D, you go into it and it talks, there's these other races, but humans are predominant. But the way people play that really isn't reflected. I'm thinking a couple things needs to happen. Possibly Wizards needs to rewrite that bit. Humans are rare because people don't want to play humans. There's just not enough humans out in the world now because no one plays them.
I also feel like sort of the in-universe justification is almost just like humans are the neutral everyman, also kind of slash assumptions about the nature of humanity tied into the realities of like weird colonial arcs, like the same way that like common is a universal tongue, and it's like the ways semi-universal tongues happen in our world are pretty brutal. So like, what's your logic for that being in a fantasy world? And if it's not the same as our, like, be thoughtful about that too, because yeah, you can roll right into some pretty sad and nasty directions without meaning to. But yeah, I feel like my sort of internal arc has been essentially just, I've already homed my world so much that humans are not necessarily more common than anyone else. And where they do exist, they tend to live intermixed with other different D&D peoples, because I built a world that doesn't have a lot of long histories of people having distinct land associations, because it's the main conceit is that it's beset by like falling rocks from the sky all the time and no one knows why. So a lot of societies never developed a sense that having a settled relationship to a specific piece of land was important, because you might have to move suddenly at any moment. So you connect to a region or a biome, and that's important to you, but not like this one place where the town is. Which also means that you just cross paths with other people way more often. And the groups that chose not to had to get really defensive and intense about it, and that's sort of a category. But yeah, it's interesting to see how people play with that, and I feel like I totally get their perspective on it, but I will still play humans in a lot of cases, but not generally D, but I play so many one-shots in systems where humans are the only option, or where humans, I feel like they work narratively differently, because in something like D&D, humans are also boring in their stats. And their sort of background in the world, like, there feels like there's way more fun, weird things to go with. But I feel like there are ways to make systems that don't make that the automatic arc. But often it means cutting out other things that are humans as option.
Yeah, that seems to be a pretty big part of it. And also, it seems like our campaigns have a lot of parallels, because you keep saying things, and I'm like, hey, we've got that going on. Orland.
Lots of giant asteroids, or what's your?
We have magical rocks created by a war between the gods that have impacted Orland several times, and because of the nature of these rocks, magic is messed up.
Ooh.
I wrote a mechanic for it, and it's just, you never know if a spell's gonna go off and it's gonna just be okay, or if it's gonna be really bad or really good. You never know. And there's a bit of a scale with just how bad or just how good when it does, and it's like you just don't quite know. And then the DM built, because on so both the games I do on my channel are Adventures in Orland. One is run by me, and the other is run with me as a player. Mm-hmm. The first one is where I'm a player. The second one is the DM one, where I'm the DM, and it's 5,000 years in the future. Mm-hmm. And so I've got, a whole bunch of backstory there, which, because of that, it being 5,000 years in the future, it's like, all right, I can take two of my favorite third-party content modules and smush them on top of this. But in the first one, the DM added onto the mechanic that being within a certain distance of certain shards from these impact events will also warp even further how magic works in that world. It's nice. It's fun. It's fun.
Yeah. What a cool DM toolkit element to have, to just really mix things up as needed. Wow.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, it goes really, really wild, because there's all that, and then, like, my character came from a plane where magic was normal, and she comes to this world and quickly finds out you can't do that, because you don't know what's gonna happen.
Oh. What a good example of having just enough knowledge to get yourself in.
Yeah, and so, once we get, like, into the game and stuff, it took a long time for her to, as an adventurer even, start using magic, because she's like, no, bad things happen. No, I'm here because this world exists, and bad things happen because this world exists. This wasn't even on my plane. I just want to go home. So she's gotten over it. Sure, princess attitude. She's a princess.
First response, though, I can see how that would be pretty concerning if that was your main previous experience with magic and it got all shaken up. Thinking you know the rules to a situation and then having them shift on you is just a really good mechanic for unsettling things generally.
Yeah, the future one takes it a little bit further because we've got the fact that at some point they'd actually made everything stable and they were actually using these shards as a source of energy, as fuel, as, you know, it's how they powered their world. It's how they powered computers and everything, spaceships. There's people stranded out in space can't come home because you get close enough and stuff fails. How are you going to land your craft?
Oh no.
You know, so you can't land. You can't cast magic again because, sure, we know how these ones work and they're not really an issue, but now there's these new ones because 5 years ago we had another dang impact.
Oh no. Oh, I named a city Impact in my world because it's in a huge crater from like one of the falls. And the main conceit in mine is that like throughout most of like known history, like these asteroid showers like happened all the time. And then about 500 years ago, they stopped, and no one knows why. And so, of course, there's all kinds of different theories as to why, and there's still all this sort of cultural legacy and baggage of how people learned to create defenses against them, whether it was by never staying still or by building amazing amounts of structure around it, or in the case of, I sort of built the structure of the Underdark in that the peoples who were living underground specifically are some of the only ones who developed really intense sense of like the ability to have a landed gentry or the potential for something like a feudal system, because you could manage land over a big historic time arc and it wouldn't suddenly get crushed by rock because you're already far under the ground. And so they think everyone who lives on the surface has a death wish, and like must just be wildly like unreasonable, dangerous people to be willing to live in a world where rocks could fall on you at any moment. And the people on the surface think the people underground are like weird isolationists stick in the mud. But the having this change 500 years ago, I felt like was also a fun way to create a narrative for why there's lots of adventurers wandering around doing weird things, because it's sort of a new era in travel. People are willing to travel, but it's mainly kind of weird, daring people with some fighting skills who are still willing to travel, because this is still a relatively untested field of just traveling for the sake of it and not because you need to for safety. So it's interesting to see like how things can spiral out. Like once you create a technology or if you like world building, how many things scatter outward from that initial premise, what you can do with them.
Yeah, well, and that was a lot of the point with mine is I want to be able to take this really cool thing and build even further on it. We have a Impact place, however, it's not named Impact. It was an existing town that we, well, our cleric and our artificer found this portal that they decided to try and stabilize, which means they opened it back up. Well, they think they did. And stuff started coming back the right way. It was bad. We had scions and stuff coming through this portal. And we leave town not aware of this issue. We get a message, and so we start hurrying back. The cleric has this massive intelligent scarab beetle that can move super fast, so he gets there ahead of us, and the party largely blames him, and that's why he takes off. Like, he forsakes his god, because he's pissed about everything. He doesn't think it's funny at all. His god was one of those that enjoys trickery and stuff. And we end up evacuating as many people as we can, and then just closing the gates. Anyone that was left. And, you know, we tried to do what we did, but we set fires as we were out. Well, the nearest town the next biggest town to us is actually capital of the continent, and they have airships, and what none of us knew is that they are pretty heavily militia people, and they bomb the place. It's a crater now.
Oh my god.
Yeah.
That's brutal.
Yeah, how dare they?
Yeah, so many different weird dimensions and arcs you can do with worlds like that. And this is just us talking about D&D, and as I've noted, like, D&D is not even really, like, the primary game for me. I learned about weird indie one-shots first, and then I sort of went backwards and learned about D&D later, and folded that into what I do. But my home stomping ground is much more of, like, very strange, tiny games with no prep that you play in one session. But I like finding excuses for world building. I like learning about campaign systems, even if they're harder to find the time and space to run. Which is part of why I like Scum and Villainy, especially because it's so good at helping you just create a really entangled world where there's all kinds of weird space criminal factions and space government factions and parties of all kinds. And your party starts the game definitely in debt to at least some of them, and favored by some, and wanted by some. And then they get to be on the run in space, and you have lots of interesting characters and influences you can pull out of your pocket all of a sudden.
One of the other players is in my chat, and they were bringing up there was a realization recently that we could actually potentially get my character home.
Whoa.
Using the banishment spell.
That's a emotionally weird way to use the banishment spell, but I dig it.
Yeah, but there's this thing where we don't know, because it was a teleportation ritual, so it could support 9 people, right? Mm-hmm. And we don't know where her family landed. We don't know if they're still in this other plane or if they're spread around now, right? So
you can banish her back to a place where family still wasn't there, and then she'd be even farther away from trying to find them.
Well, and potentially more danger even.
Yeah.
Because political upheaval and ruling family. So.
Wow.
But there's been talk recently that with an upcoming encounter, it is bad. We had to roll up backup characters just in case. And what's being brought up is if it comes down to this cleric who now has much more stable magic suddenly, and a new god that he's working with. If it's down to just the 2 of us, he's banishing her.
Wow.
He's sending her home, and
that's really tender and intense. Like, what a cool, weird game plan to sort of have, and this sort of back burner potential depending on where a story takes you.
Yeah. We've been playing this. I know I've been playing mine for over a year now, so that's. I've never had character resolution, and that would be a form of resolution, possibly.
Yeah. So. One-shot games are weird in that, in like some ways, you get distinct character resolution because it's designed to make it happen faster, but there's a different form of character investment, so it still lands differently. You can have a lot of fun, but you didn't craft them and build their story over a long period of time. But I feel like, yeah, I've never gotten to play a campaign game where I got to hit a character resolution point, and yeah, it would be a lot. It seems like it activates a really different kind of intensity.
Well, because it's like, but I love this person.
I know. It's not just the stats anymore. I've been so involved in being this person for an extended period of time. I mean, like, from a theater perspective, it's like if you were playing a character in an ongoing show for a year and then it reached the end of the production run, like, that would be weird, even if it was also celebratory.
I can see that. Yeah. Oh, I'm not ready.
Yeah, I can tell. Like, I'm feeling some of. Yeah, I kind of want to know. Like, I don't necessarily want your character to be banished, but also that would be so cool in like a weird, bittersweet, scary way.
Yeah. So, I'm just hoping that, as excited as I am about the potential of playing a new character, because if we have a party wipe and we have to pull in our new characters, This character will then give me the ability to actually play out a thing I threw into the future.
Ooh.
And have a definitive, yes, these are linked by this one item. So that's
so the backstory building, powerful.
Yeah. So it's like, on one hand, no. On the other hand, yes. And why? If we could schedule things out, why couldn't we just run an AU where on one end party wipes, on the other end party doesn't wipe, and it just diverges? Can we do a divergent type campaign?
That sounds like a beautiful way to make a bunch more work involved, but also that sounds like a very fun show premise, honestly. Like a show that is an AU of itself, where things are running in parallel.
That could be interesting. But then again, that comes back to getting groups together.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah, hard enough to get folks together for one campaign, much less the campaign and the campaign's own parallel universe.
Yeah. Well, I mean, with the one where it's a TPK, that gives the ability to say, well, maybe these players aren't able to make it, but I mean, we would have been bringing in new adventures anyways.
True.
So, within the tabletop community, what's your experience been like? What do you think has been good, and what do you think could really improve?
Oh god, that's a big question. And I feel like a lot of the things that can be said about tabletop game community, other people have already said more thoughtfully and thoroughly than I can. I feel like a lot of my gratitude and positives for it, I feel like it's been a place that, at least for me, has been a place that I could enter without a lot of extensive background knowledge, that I could come into it kind of new and mainly knowing podcasts and having a few friends who played tabletop games and talked to me about them. And that it felt like I could still step into that world. And a lot of that is because of the spaces around it, the places where I could find guides and resources and games that were really easy to just download and play, and also all the people who stream, who create YouTube videos, who create podcasts, let you get a sort of demonstrated sense of how the games feel to play. So of course, it's also important to remember, and we've already talked about, those kind of experiences that folks share are not the same as what's going to happen at a private table. There are different dimensions to that, but it still gives you a lot of tools and context, which I think matters a lot. But just the fact that it was something that I could do, and particularly the fact that I really started playing tabletop games on the regular while I was a graduate student living on an island. And so I wasn't necessarily playing them a lot, but I was coming to Seattle several times a month to try to make that happen. And it became this really important sort of emotional anchor for me that let me connect to a wider world beyond the literal island, where I was learning a lot, but also feeling increasingly isolated, just because there were so many structural factors where I was living and working and studying all in the same place, and the bleed of the time in that, the sense that I was always in school, was really strong. And so for me, tabletop games were a thing that let me create really distinct narrative moments and time blocks where I was not at school. I was not even on Earth. I was in a distinct place, and I got to be there for a few hours. And the other element of that was really important was, at least in the game spaces that I was able to find my way into, they were places where folks opened events by talking about boundaries and safety tools. And I also pretty firmly believe that the safety tools we have in the game now are not enough, and I'm really glad for all the discussions happening around that in terms of finding other ways to approach that and making sure that our toolkits just keep getting bigger, because I'm grateful for systems and concepts like lines and veils and the X, but just saying or voicing those things or those boundary options is not enough to ensure the gameplay experience is going to be good. But then the other dimension of that is there are lots of other social spaces where people don't intro events by talking about boundaries at all. That's not even something that's conceptually on the table. And especially for me, when I was first getting into the tabletop game scene, I found out about stuff through meetup.com. And there were lots of things I could have gone to in Seattle through. I could have gone to bars with people, or singles mixers, or art events, or hiking groups, or other hobby activities. But a lot of those involve things like being in either a really physically close space or sometimes an isolated physically close space with people you don't really know. And so tabletop games had the advantage of being relatively public, like happening in game stores, places that didn't cost a lot of money, that didn't require you to drink alcohol, that didn't require you to dress a certain way, or have like very many like specifically mobility or energy things involved, because you can sit down, but also it doesn't ruin the game to get up and stretch or move. And also that I could go somewhere, and the first thing that happened, or I did kind of an intimate social interaction, was we would talk about who we were and what we were going to do together and what the safety structures and boundaries. And that's not a perfect system, but it's way more of a system. It is a system. There was a system for talking about that. And there were not a lot of other ways to meet new people from a standing start in a new city that I was seeing that thought about that. So that for me has been really like it's a space with a lot of brutal stuff. Again, there's ground that they talk their way through much more clearly than I think that's been happening with a long series of abusers like getting outed and talked about, and I'm glad that's happening. Sad that what has happened, but I'm also grateful to be in a space where when that happens, a lot of what I see is people say, here are safety tools, here are resources, here are best practices, guidelines. I'm here if you need to talk, like here are ways that this has been my community space, like I'm here for people if they need it, and people really trying to put out their tools for how to deal with those problems. Because I feel like any sort of social space, especially the cultural, like, oh, we're distinct or we're special or we're separate or we have different social rules or norms, and that makes better or more creative or better organized. And I've seen that in all kinds of social circles beyond gaming ones, but I feel like almost any place that works like that, there are folks who can to mobilize the language of that space, even when their ends are negative or scary. But I'm still grateful for the conversations that are happening, and I feel like, again, this is a space where what I've learned as an educator has really felt relevant and like I can enmesh it with the game space well. And I feel like that speaks well of it, that this is a space where though it's certainly far from perfect and there's some really scary and tragic things that do happen in our communities, it's a space where I see people actively trying to figure out how to have conversations about safety and power and communication and what those mean and how those work. And in some ways it feels parallel to a lot of things I see in education, because that's also a space where there can be like serious forms of structural violence and power imbalance. And a lot of what I'm grateful for is not that I'm in an inherently perfect community, but that I'm in a community that tries to talk about things and where I see more tools building over time. That was a super long answer and it looped a lot. But yeah, that's sort of the pros and the cons all together. I see people trying to do the work that will make spaces better, and I feel like the things that we learn through these spaces can be applied beyond just tabletop, and I'm grateful for that.
I agree. I remember, because I wasn't aware of stuff like safety tools and all that, but I'd also, for the longest time, played specifically with one group, and that was it. I didn't meet this group through a game shop or anything. It was through, a relationship that I was in. And so that was what I knew. I wasn't even aware that, hey, these things could be things, I've got experience with a couple sit-down groups outside of that, not much. I know that for some people it can be really hard to connect with people you don't know. Do you feel that game shops are really, really good at doing that at this point, or could there potentially be a better way?
It's wildly specific to the game shop and to the people at the game shop. I feel like the main benefit that game shops have is that they are sometimes spaces that have tables in them already set up for gameplay that you can sit around, and they let you do that for free. And so that lowers the barrier to entry to have a communal space to set up those kind of activities. But no, I mean, like, I have been lucky in that I have lived in a couple of places that have had some really lovely game shops with thoughtful and welcoming staff who also do things like let us have free gameplay space, so that there are chances to have a social format for that, because it's also safer and easier to play with people that you don't know yet if you get to go to a shared public place rather than having to go to somewhere isolated or someone's house. But I think there's a lot more that can be done on a lot of fronts. And some of it is like there's structural limits to what employees can afford to do and take time to organize if they're not being paid for it. And a lot of the stuff that I do, it's entirely being run by volunteers, which both means, oh, cool, people are bringing all this passion into it and doing this because they specifically like it, and also means we're all volunteers. We have limited time and energy. We need to do things around our existing work schedules and the other facets of our life. And so that affects who can attend and how much time people have to put into doing things like organizing tools and systems and norms and guidelines. So I feel like a lot of what can really create benefits on that front is resource sharing, both positive and negative. Like, tell the stories of when you had a fun experience and when something was really cool and what made that happen, what facilitated it. Was the space structurally useful for it in some way? Was the timing or the location really good? Were the people facilitating it particularly helpful? What did they do that struck you as helpful? Were you playing with familiar people? Did it help to arrive with a group of friends? Were you playing with strangers? Was it a cool way to meet people? Like, think about what worked for you and talk about that and share those stories, because the more stories we have out there, the more potential there is for folks to imagine that this is something that they could do, both as a player or even as a volunteer or facilitator. Because if we're able to talk about how these groups started or how they're founded or how they worked, the more transparency and skill sharing there is with that, the less people have to start from scratch to figure out how to do it themselves. And the other element of that, and that's something that I've been really grateful for, and I have a lot of bookmarks saved around these things to dig through, is when folks share things like, here are safety guidelines, or here are facilitation tools, or even just here are the way we intro or format events, like here's how long our sessions run for, or here are structural factors. And some of those are things that, especially if you're already enmeshed in a space, start to feel like an assumptive norm that everyone should have, and then it's not until you step back that you realize it's distinctive. Like, I ran into tabletop games that were focused on telling story games, so way more narrative focused than dice and stats focus, and that were one-shot games with no prep. So you just got to show up and create a collaborative narrative for 3 to 5 hours and then leave. That's a very particular game experience, but for me, it's been a huge facet of my game world, and it's important to remember, for me, that that's not the only thing tabletop looks like. Also, I found spaces that intentionally talked about safety tools. That doesn't mean that any of our systems are perfect, but I got to learn about tabletop games through the assumption that before you play one, you talk about safety tools. And that is absolutely not a generalizable experience. That is something that people in groups that I've been in very specifically enacted as a community norm. So thinking about what your community norms are and why they're there and how they get reinforced and what the benefits or negatives are of reinforcing them, I think is really important. So yeah, like, honestly, for me, game spaces, they're useful in that they provide physical space and they provide a cultural context where people are not surprised to see game sessions being run. And so they provide an entry point. They're a place people will look if they're trying to figure out how they might end up wanting to play games. I've been at events where folks just saw it on the meetup, or in some cases even saw it on Google Maps, because Google Maps was like noting events that were occurring at a spot that they were looking at on the map, and they were looking at the comic and game shop. So I feel like the physical point of entry factor is big for that. But I think there's online spaces that do really cool stuff with that too. Like, the first time I was ever on a stream, it was because Scraticus Academy DM'd me on Twitter and went, "Would you like to be on a stream?" And I was like, I hadn't thought about it, but I don't see why not, so sure. And then it was extremely fun.
Scrats, the way he runs stuff there is really, really awesome.
Scrats is great. So grateful for that.
They do amazing work there, and just
Absolutely.
The way everything is ran on that channel is... I kind of feel exhausted for them sometimes, watching the amount of staff. I play there. And it's like, Scrat, I don't know how you do this. You're awesome.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
yeah, I feel like Scraticus Academy is a good example of a channel that demos a lot of tools and practices. And I've also seen, like, there's the parts that you don't see live on stream, but before a stream, where we're going through, like, okay, let's make sure we know everyone's names and pronouns, how they want to be referred to. And also, here's things you can put in this direct chat if something is happening in game that's not working for you or isn't comfortable, and like different signal tools that we have for that, and ways to do them both either to the full group or privately just to the facilitator and things like that. And like those tools and that kind of info basis, for me, I see that as part of the heart of what makes gaming work. And it's also important I try to remember that my ability to assume that that's a shared philosophy in gaming spaces is very specific to spaces that I've been in. And I mean, those are the only spaces I'll play in, but that's still a very specific subgroup of game spaces. So I basically feel like all game spaces can expect and ask for even better on terms of safety tools. The ones that don't have them, obviously, and the ones that do have them, keep working. We're not done. This is not a project that's ever going to be done. We can always be working to try to bring more thought and nuance and context to what we do and how we do it. It doesn't hurt us to have more tools and options.
I agree. What is your favorite style of play? When I'm talking style play, I'm talking like theater of mind, grids, rule of cool, that kind of thing.
Theater of mind, for sure. I've almost never played games that are based on grids, partially because I play so many narratively focused ones. So rule of cool is the other big one. And a lot of games that I have played in, even to some degree, mechanize or encourage you to do a thing just because it's fun or weird. I really love games that have a really big shared narrative authority structure. And I also, I don't think this is necessarily a particularly official term. I think this is what Avery Alder called it in a talk that she gave, character non-monogamy, where you have shared authority over one or more characters, and who's in charge of a particular character rotates. That's not the only kind of game I like, but there's a few different game systems I've played that involve that, and I really love them. I think it gives you a particularly weird, charming style of gameplay that works very well, especially for stories that involve messiness, miscommunication, conflict, or emotional nuance. Because if you get to create a character as a team and explore their life as a team, you get to take them in different directions, and that's structurally encouraged and okay. But you also have a shared investment in trying to tell a story that flows with that.
I think that's a pretty good way to work at it. I'd never heard of games where there was really shared character. Is this like as a table thing, or is it specific people? I know we have something kind of similar.
There's a good example of it structurally. Do I have the game? I don't have the game on my shelf where I can grab it. I know where it should be, but I think it's in one of my bags. Downfall is a game that's specifically for 3 players, and it plays out as a one-shot where you design a society that has a fatal flaw, and that fatal flaw is going to destroy the society. You as players know that. The characters don't necessarily know that yet. And so you collaboratively create 3 characters. The hero is trying to save society from the flaw. You as players know they're going to fail, but as a character, the hero is going to work really, really hard to save their society. The fallen is fine with the flaw. They may or may not realize that it's going to destroy society, but whether or not they realize it, they think it's good. They're comfortable with that direction society is moving. And the pillar is kind of like the status quo character. They don't necessarily notice how bad things are, and they're much more comfortable keeping things as they are, even if it means they have to make compromises or do things that are not necessarily to their personal benefit. And so you collaboratively design this world and its flaws and some cultural traditions and structures that are involved in it, and you collaboratively design the 3 characters, and then you rotate. So from scene to scene, you will variously be the hero, the fallen, and the pillar. And the characters have connections and relationships to each other, and so you get to play with those from different perspectives. And it's can be kind of a brutal game in some interesting ways, because you are following the course of a crumbling world. But it also lets you be really interesting and creative and tender with each other as you're playing, because you've all gotten to inhabit a different place in the narrative. And so I feel like it encourages you to make a really interesting and broad range of narrative decisions and approaches, because you can do something to try to really save or help things, or you can do something to make things worse. And all of those things benefit the story, and all of those things sort of quote unquote benefit one or more of your characters. And it also means you create characters that you couldn't have created on your own. Like, that collaborative design process creates context that I think end up being really interesting.
Sounds really, really... definitely gonna have to check that one out sometime.
Yeah, Downfall. It's just what it says on the on the package. You will watch the downfall of a world. There's a fun mechanic too for figuring out sort of thematic elements for describing the world. I've told all kinds of formats. Floating cloud cities full of light, like weird tech metropolises that are like that are color coded into different class divided stratospheres using like flickering neon. You can create really weird landscapes. Did one that was like all superheroes, and there's different play sets that help you tweak that as you like to, but it's a very adaptive setting because it's GM-less and one shot, and you just start. You don't know what the world is going to be until you sit down at the table with the two other players, and then you build it together.
That's awesome. I think that gets us through the questions I had, which means we're ready for our open Q&A with chat. We've had a few questions come in already, as well as input on a magic mechanic.
Nice.
No, spell, on a spell that someone's looking for. If anyone else in chat has any questions they would like to ask Naomi, feel free to post them in chat and I will add them to the queue. First up, we have a question. Do you go to any conventions, and what is your favorite and least favorite con experience?
Ooh, I love that question. I do go to quite a lot of conventions, more lately than in the past. I often volunteer at conventions because I don't have a lot of money. And also, I really like volunteering at things. I feel like being a con volunteer often gives you a cool window into the con experience. It gives you a format of a thing to do if you're not familiar with the space, and it helps you meet other people involved in running the space. Also, sometimes the green rooms are really good and they have tea and snacks and all that kind of stuff. I've had happily mostly pretty positive con experiences. I've been to Emerald City Comic-Con a couple of times. Most of my cons have been in the Seattle area. I went to WonderCon in Anaheim once when I was in undergrad, and that was like my first con ever, and I loved it, and I was just so starstruck and excited to be at a con in general. So on some fronts, that's one of the best because I was just so delighted. I just went through the whole experience so happy that I was at that event. But I've also been to Emerald City Comic-Con. OrcaCon is a really fun one that's focused specifically on tabletop games, so RPGs, but also board and card games. And it's also explicitly an inclusivity-focused convention. And I love volunteering at that one. That's had some of my most positive experiences in a volunteer context because the volunteer team are such cool, thoughtful people. Their accessibility coordinator is great. Like, they really put a lot of thought into those aspects of the convention. And so that always feels like a really cool team to be a part of. And also, one of the volunteer roles at OrcaCon is game host, which means you are in charge of hanging out in the game free play rooms, being welcoming and open, helping other people learn to play games, and facilitating. So I've gotten to be a volunteer who just plays games with people for 8 solid hours, and then my voice died. But it's worth it. I've also been to Geek Girl Con. I've only been to that once. It was a pretty cool experience overall. It was one I didn't get to see much of. I took so many volunteer shifts that I was mainly just on the gaming floor. But that was one where I liked a lot of the energy and people. There were some structural factors in that where just there was sound bleed from different events that sucked, but part of that was just I talk a lot, and so at that one I was trying to give info to people from out of a volunteer booth section, and there were speakers behind me, and I threw my voice because I was trying to talk over some speakers. But all of the interactions and events I got to go to there were really fun. I've also been to sort of smaller scale zine and art events. I love the Short Press Comics and Art Expo in Seattle. It's yearly free, and it really focuses on small press creators, and so it's less big gaming setups and big talks, but lots and lots of cool small booths with people selling really gorgeous, creatively designed art and comics and stickers and patches. And it's a lot easier to talk to creators one-on-one if that's something you like, because there's less of single big names getting mobbed by everyone, and more oh cool, tell me a little bit about this book you wrote, and do you want to do a zine trade, and I'm gonna get that sticker for my girlfriend, that kind of arc. And I've also been to Cal Arts LA. I'm trying to remember. I think that's what it was called. There was a Los Angeles sort of comics and art event that was also a free entry one, Short Run Comics and Art Expo. And that's the first one that I ever took my girlfriend Angela to. and she'd never been to a con or art event before, and I kind of assumed that it would be her obliging me by attending because I'm much more of the comic nerd than she is. She's a nerd in other capacities. She knows infinitely more about video games than I do. But it was such a lovely, cool, welcoming space, and it also had a lot of LGBTQ creators and a lot of Latinx creators, and she just started talking to the different booth vendors and met some really cool comic artists and ended up getting some business cards, and she went on to interview one of the creators she talked to on the like queer women of color based arts and news site that she writes. So CalArts LA was also a blast. Like, really, really cool range of creators and really good chance to just like talk about creative projects and find cool small press stuff. So I really like small events. I love the big ones too. At the big ones, I like to volunteer because they're so big that if I'm not volunteering, I kind of don't know what to do with my. There's too much happening. At small events, I'll just come and wander more. I'll also, apologies if there's any little crinkly noises, but in prepping for future conventions, now that I have way more games that I've made, I'm working on, I went to a risograph printing workshop and I'm going to learn some more print. I also went to a screen printing workshop recently, and at the screen printing workshop, I made a bunch of patches that say trade zines with me. And so I'm going to sew some of those onto my stuff for future events, and also probably put some stuff related to RPGs on me so that people know that they can approach me and trade weird little mini games with me. Because that's one of my favorite things to do at conventions, is to talk about art with people and to trade art with.
Sounds really, really awesome.
Yeah, I love cons. I'm very extroverted, so being in a big packed place full of people is kind of my dream, and I'll literally just do that until I throw my voice out, which happens at pretty much every con. I'm just used to it at this point. I always try to avoid it, and I usually fail. I just bring a lot of cough drops.
Sounds like a good move. It's my understanding, because I haven't been to a con myself, that with the big cons, you pretty much want to have cough drops and stuff anyways, because crud.
Cough drops, ibuprofen, tea if you've got it, comfy walking shoes. Oh, I also forgot to mention PodCon. That one's podcasting specific. I went to the recent PodCon 2 in Seattle, and I talked about that a little bit earlier, but that was also charming. And that one I didn't volunteer at, but that one I went to for free because they have a scholarship program for folks who are low income and local to Seattle. So I also love that. I love cons that do like active accessibility work in structural ways and in financial ways, and it makes me way more hyped to talk about and support them. So I just wanted to throw props out there to PodCon for that.
Next question was, what's your dream accomplishment in the space currently?
Ooh, that's a good question. Honestly, right now, this is not the biggest dream, but I want to make some genuinely beautiful print versions of my games. Right now, they pretty much all exist digitally with the exception of Market Magic. And This Party Sucks, which I both have print and play versions that can turn into small zines. But Market Magic is a one-page mini-zine that I drew it out by hand while I was volunteering at Geek Girl Con, actually. So that was made pretty quickly and scrappily. And This Party Sucks I formatted kind of fast because I was making it for a game jam. But yeah, I want to do more formatting and print work, and I want to make versions of my games that like look really bright and fun and inviting and are fun to hold in your hand, and that I can like mail to my high-level Patreon backers and find a good format for selling online and trade with people at shows. Even bigger than that, and more specifically, one of my more recent games, my emotional mecha jam game, which is called Salvage What We Can Together. You create a mech pilot and their mech, and there's a bunch of different sorts of sets of traits related to those that you can use to make them. I love the game as it is now. It essentially has like random tables you can use to draw from to design your mech. I want to do some fun illustrations, either myself or this is the big dream. Okay, in the big dream, I want to commission someone who's better at drawing mechs than I am, and I want to make some beautiful art cards that have pre-designed, shuffle them and draw them out, pre-designed characters and mechs and dangerous situations for the pilots and mechs to be in, so that you could shuffle 3 beautiful little card decks and then draw one from each and have a game set up and ready to play. That would be the dream, to be in a place where I can commission someone else to do some awesome art of that for me and create like a physical version of that game that has a whole extra like lovingly illustrated quick play element. So yeah, I'm sure I could think of bigger dreams in time, but right now, getting to a point where I can commission other people to do cool art for my games, that would rock. I would love that.
It's interesting you bring up mech artists because I know one, so I'll get that information to you.
Ooh.
You might know who I'm thinking of though. So, but they do commissions.
I know a lot of potential mech artists, but none of them are folks where I've been like, I'm in a place where I could commission you right now. I have enough vision and format to give you, but please tell me after. I'd be happy about that.
Awesome. Okay. One of the other questions. Can you ask them how they would feel about a male-identifying person playing a non-binary character?
Do it. I mean, format matters. If you're playing it on a stream and you're making money and there's no non-binary people on your stream, then I'm probably not going to be super psyched about it. Like, give us chances to play as ourselves in the game space. But honestly, and on my relationship podcast, we talk about this quite a bit. If you have questions about some of my philosophies on that, we have an episode called Trans 201. So it doesn't start from the absolute 101 info, but it goes into deeper contextual info about being trans and how that operates in relationships. I think I would like more people to play non-binary characters because I like non-binary people to be able to play non-binary characters without outing themselves by doing so. So if you do that, you are in part facilitating that. Also, my dream for pretty much everyone about their gender and sexuality is for you to have a sense of your identity that's based on having thought about and decided that you're in a place that feels good and comfortable for you. Not assuming that where you are is where you are because you have to be there and there's no other option. So I think people in general should at least sometimes try playing characters that are different gender than them. Like, obviously, like, you don't have to. If it stresses you out and makes you sad or feels weird, don't. But if it's something that you're open to, try it, because I think it's a good thing to think about and to know how to do, just for understanding who you are as a person. I would generally say that, like, and again, and also just, if folks have specific questions about that, I'm on Twitter. I'll happily talk about non-binary stuff. If it's something you're worried about, or if there's come up in a game, or you're not sure how to do it, I'm happy to talk about that more with folks. My one other thing I would say is do at least a little bit of reading by non-binary writers, and also consider buying some media by non-binary writers if you're going to really dig into playing a character on that format, both because you'll learn stuff, and because if you're going to use us narratively in a really, like, long form or produced or shared way, give us some money, please, because lots of people do lots of consultation work for folks for free because they'd like to have less bigoted narratives, but a lot of the times we don't get paid for it. So if it's in the capacity for you to at least even tip someone who's helped you learn a new thing that has helped you in your enacting of your character, acknowledge them for that. If they've got media things to share them. If they've got a way to get tipped, please tip them. But absolutely do it. Also consider playing non-binary characters who aren't also like angels or aliens or robots or in some way distinctively non-human, because I love that stuff and I'm totally happy for those characters to be in media too, but it's becoming more and more of a trend that there will be one non-binary character in a thing and they're also the inhuman. So if you're in a format where some of the characters are human, be human sometimes too. Long answer, other dimensions to it. But yeah, do it thoughtfully, do a little research, don't freak out or worry about being exhaustive, but do your best to be kind and thoughtful and respectful. I can link distinct resources if folks want those. I have literally given presentations about this. And if you really want to dig into it, hire me, because I'm a game designer and I've also done Trans 101 and 201 and like gender information and like relationship health presentations for money. So yeah, that's the long, snarky, but also genuine answer. Please do it, and I hope you have a good time with it, and you learn something cool, and it supports you in your understanding of yourself.
Awesome. That's a lot of stuff. So yeah,
I have a lot of feelings about that. It was a good question.
Very, very good one. Mm-hmm. Okay, the next one, that is the one regarding a spell. It would have a casting time as instant. As a reaction, its range is 150 feet centered on self. Components is visual, somatic, and material. I think I'm wrong with the V. VSM, okay.
Verbal,
probably.
material.
Yeah.
So you speak, you move, and there's an item. I'm not a D&D expert. I could be wrong, but
that sounds right,
that's my
though.
best guess.
That sounds right. So the VSM on that is 100% of total hit points, causing your character to, of course, immediately be unconscious after the spell. The duration is 2 minutes or 20 rounds. As you see your party begin to falter and fall, you may, as a reaction, cast this spell, sacrificing your body to rewind time for 2 minutes, reversing all the damage done to your party, but not the enemies, and allowing them to maintain their memories of the last 2 minutes. You remain unconscious for 64 hours after the spell expires. If the target of your retribution is in the conflict, you do not immediately fall unconscious as you are driven by the spirit of vengeance. However, no matter the outcome, at the end of the 2 minutes, you fall unconscious.
So what kind of feedback do they want on the spell? Because my first response is, I like it because it most certainly operates by rule of cool, which in my mind is one of the most important rules. That sounds like a spell that is overall so grindingly hard on your character that it's not something you could use casually, but that if you wanted to pull something out of your bag of tricks to create a really intense narrative moment, that it's very good for doing that. That you could even be like powerfully driven by vengeance to create a dramatic boost of healing to help spur people through a particularly narratively important conflict, and then you pass out and you get to be, the site of all kinds of like comfort and the gradual waking up and who knows what's happened in the past 64 hours and the effects of your actions, and there's room for cool unexpected consequences in all kinds of narrative directions off of that, because you are in some ways sacrificing a moment of narrative control in order to have one very dramatic moment of narrative. So that's fun. But yeah, what did they want to know about it? Just want sort of general feedback, or I'd also, one other thing I'd say about it is like
I guess one of the questions is what the level would be for that one. Another bit that I didn't get to was that the player remains unconscious for the duration of the 64. Where did that come in?
Oh, the 64-hour thing, like they are
64 hours.
For a big span of time afterwards.
Yeah, you remain unconscious even if you get healed to full health, as you are under a magical induced coma by the power of your god.
I'm not a super strong expert on what the relevant levels are for different things, so I don't feel I feel I'm much more qualified to comment on the narrative elements of it, for which I would say on some fronts, I mean, this obviously feels pretty dang high level. I feel like if you didn't want it to be very as high level, another option would be this to be something where you need at least one particularly weird or dangerous component to cast it, so that narratively effectively you can probably only cast it once or twice ever, because the ingredients are weird. It's also so intense in its effect that I get narratively why it would be both, like, why it would be verbal and somatic and material, and part of me almost wonders if it needs to be, because there's so many other things that make it hard to cast. I think if you furiously and silently like crushed a cursed ruby in your hand and that cast it, that would also work fine. But I get why there would be lots of different layers to casting it, because it's designed to be a high drama spell. My other sort of narrative comment on it, I'm sorry I can't help you with the leveling part as much, though I'm sure other people on the internet can, maybe even other people in chat, I don't know. I would say if your character is unconscious for that long, that I would encourage you to create opportunities either built into the spell or just as narrative suggestions for you to have very weird dreams. That's a good point for you to be semi-aware of something that's happening in the world, and maybe getting some sensory input of it that comes in through dreams. It's also a great chance, if you'd like to give the DM a chance to give you some info as though it's coming from your god or some other experiential element. That's a way for you to be enmeshed in plot or to help drive new directions in the plot, even if your character is unconscious. And also casting something that brutal on your system, then that magically intense, seems like it might affect your dreams in general. So yeah, thanks for sharing a spell. You just like wrote giant battle drama moment spell, and I'm into it. That sounds fun. I hope that there's a cool use for that in a campaign that you're running, maybe that some other folks run too.
It's been brought up that that particular character is known for weird dreams, raptor cow, and a top hat and all that.
That makes sense. I'm glad I intuited the weird And that definitely seems like a situation so ready for weird dreams to occur.
Far as the level, from my experience, I would say I agree that it's definitely a high level spell.
Oh, yeah.
I would say it's even above because it was put as for question mark before it went into the rest of the details on it. I would say that's probably closer to a level 6 or 7 spell,
I'd agree.
or something that absolutely would need to be cast as a ritual, and so you have to, then it makes sense to need all these other components. At the same time, it wouldn't be a reaction. You'd need time to cast it. But at the same, if you do that, maybe certain components could extend how long the effect works. I did fail to mention the magical mechanical crit fail portion, because that is a base part of the campaign, and that's in line with how stuff works in the campaign in the first place.
This sounds like a really, really messy, cool campaign with a lot of narrative. I'm into it.
Okay, I guess I did miss a thing. So this is something from the game I'm in. It's something one of my players is, one of the other players, not my players, is looking for advice on, because I guess they're looking for a way to prevent a potential thing here. So basically the way the system works is you first roll a d30, and the reason I chose a 30 for the system is a 20 if you're trying to have something that could be flexible on where success is and fails based on a high-low roll or a high-mid-low, is very much smaller between a 20 and a 30. And I mean, you could essentially even take it to, say, a D100 and really have a full, range of things if you wanted to get that in depth. After you do that, you determine whether it's high, mid, or low. You roll a D4, unless it's mid. You don't know if it's mid, because mid it's normal. It's a spell. You did the spell. Congratulations. You did the thing, and you did it normal.
Yay!
This is what this looks like.
Expected spell.
Yes. Otherwise, you roll a D4, which changes the severity. Now, this one overrides the basic crit fail on the magic end. If you roll a 1 on the 30 and a 4 on the D4, your body's torn asunder and your spirit remains in the control of the god.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah.
Those make sense as stakes for something with that kind of intensity. It sounds like in that sort of context especially, it would be like you have been literally torn apart by vengeance.
Yeah, it's a bit nutty there. It's a bit nutty. On brand.
Yeah, thanks for sharing a spell with us. What else has chat got for us?
Next one is, do you watch Critical Role? What is your thoughts on Critical Role with the huge community of RPG players that might bring new and old players together?
I don't watch Critical Role because it's so very, very long and I don't have time. My girlfriend watches Critical Role and she loves it. So I assume it's quite good because I trust her tastes. I love the character designs. I see fan art of them all over the place because there's a significant overlap in the circles I run in and folks who watch Critical Role. So I think it's a cool force. Between my girlfriend and I, we have the two main... I listen to the Adventure Zone and she watches Critical. So that's the community facet I have more experience with. But my sense of both is that I think they're both really great examples of how actual play shows that are run by folks who have like a lot of sort of acting and theatrical energy to bring to it and a lot of like sort of thoughtful editing and structure to it can create these really fun and engaging experiences that are cool to consume whether or not you want to play the games yourself, but also if you do want to play the games yourself, they give you some fun toolkits and ideas. I think they make things look smoother than they actually are, and I think can also sometimes lead people to make anxious or negative comparisons about their own ability to run things because the examples they're seeing look so cool and so put together. But I also feel like the casts and the DMs of both those games do a very sweet job of encouraging their fans to be folks who create and analyze their own content as well. So I feel like they're really fun entry points into the gaming world. I think they're lovely entry points into the gaming world. And I also appreciate that apparently they really annoy some people who think that that kind of stuff shouldn't get to be entry points into the gaming world. I think it absolutely should. My entry point to games was also game-based podcasts, just a slightly less vastly known one that was not D&D based. And so I think that they have a really fun role in the community as it exists right now, and I'm happy that they're out there, and I hope someday to be able to watch Critical Role. I just literally can't get myself to sit down and watch or listen to 3-ish hour long YouTube videos about things. It does not process for me well, but everything I've heard about the plot and the world has been really fun and sometimes brutal in interesting ways, which I'm also game for. So yeah, I like it. I like it by proxy is my answer. I like it by proxy, and I like what it represents for the broader world of games.
Awesome. Okay, we're going to go ahead and take another quick break. We will be back shortly.
Share some more questions if you got them. It'll give us time to mull them over. Back soon.
Yep. All right, and we're back. So, next question that we had was, what is your favorite race and class combination?
Solid question. Also, it's, again, keep in mind that I am not mainly a D&D person, so I've played a range of stuff, but often in like weird one-shot and homebrew contexts where I'm mixing things up a lot. I'll say, honestly, I had a really fun one-shot experience recently, so at least my current favorite right now is probably the Shifters. Like this sort of little class that get some semi-animal characteristics because of a semi-nebulous potential history where maybe they're descended from werewolves or maybe not. I made a Shifter character who I essentially based off of a palace cat, like very round, fluffy, cranky, like wild cat that live in extremely cold places, I believe. And I had a really, really good time being this little sort of like palace cat-esque person. And for class, I've played a lot of them. I enjoy a lot of them. I feel like I honestly really love warlocks because I feel like they're kind of a mess. Just like narratively, it's really easy to make a warlock who's just kind of a mess. Someone who's made like a really interestingly, potentially awful decision that's gone on to shape their lives. And I kind of love them for that. I feel like they provide really powerful and interesting narrative hooks. Though personally, if I was in a D&D world, I would probably be a bard. I think that's truest to character style. So I tend to design bards a lot, but especially as a DM, I love warlocks. I'm very grateful for warlocks. They give me so many threads I can pull in a story, and that makes me happy. So yeah, Shifters are fun, and I also, as a DM, I love Aarakocra because it's really, really easy to create characters for players to interact with using Aarakocra and Kenku, because you say you go up to the bar, and the bartender is a giant swan. And then they know what the bartender looks like, and you can do it very, very quickly. So I appreciate Aarakocra and Kenku because I can just spend a lot of time on Wikipedia looking at birds, and then suddenly I've created a vibrant town by hanging out on Wikipedia looking at birds, and the players are charmed, and it was faster and more visually distinct to describe who was in the town. So I encourage build a bird city. If you haven't built a bird city in your game, some of my favorite game sessions I've ever played were the time I built a bird city, and then I put a karaoke in the bird city, and they sang karaoke with a bunch of birds. So yeah, a couple different faves. As a DM, Warlocks, and Kenku and Aarakocra as a player, shifters, and bards.
Awesome. I know that my experience with bards, they're really fun, especially if you're great with words. Maybe you don't have to sing, you could do poems and stuff. And spells like Vicious Mockery? Oh my god. Yes.
I love that spell concept. I once in my grad program, we played a game of D&D, and it was a little clunky at times, and one of the more funny but awkward moments was one of my classmates was playing a bard, but he was too nice to think of anything that he could say using Vicious Mockery, so we're all very gently at the table trying to help him think of ways that he could insult this character that we were fighting, because he couldn't think of a good insult. And it was just also funny because, like, I'm sure he's capable of being creatively insulting in other formats, but I don't think he could do it to us. He couldn't get himself to insult the dungeon master. He didn't want to be mean. But it was a very cute moment.
That sounds really, really wholesome, actually.
I still remember it. It was charmingly wholesome.
Next question. What do you think is a mechanic or concept that should be used more in games? Personally, I find not enough games use weather.
Ooh, I like that they added an addendum of their own on that. I agree. Weather is very fun. And that's such a good question, and there's so many potential dimensions to it that I'm trying to think about, because there's a lot of mechanics that I love, but also mechanics are so contextual, even within the same game system, even with the same players, they can operate differently in different contexts. So I'm trying to think of what's one that I would really want to highlight. I mean, I like the thought of weather as one. I'm trying to think of what games I've played that involve weather, and I think it's not coming up with a lot of stuff for me, so I think that's a good observation. I think, I'm trying to think of what the term for this is, because I've seen different games frame it in different ways. I like when games that don't necessarily always give a ton of narrative authority to players give you specific mechanics or things that you can sort of spend, or ways that you can add something to the world using a suggestion, but you can't necessarily do it with no consequence or easily all the time. I like how in, again, Scum and Villainy, I keep mentioning, you can save money and maintain more credits by stealing or owing debts to people when you build your ship. But in order to save that money, you have also then created potential dangers to yourself and narrative hooks. I like those kind of tough choice situations, and I don't think they're necessarily underutilized in games, but I'd like to give them a little more love and highlight them, because I feel like even games that don't have them built in as mechanics can benefit from them a lot of the time, from thinking about, well, you could do that, but here will be a fun consequence. Kind of like a lot of the Powered by the Apocalypse systems have the mixed success effect. I think narratively, playing with mixed success, even if the dice don't automatically create a mixed success, can still be a fun way to improve the flow of games, where you're not making your characters just roll again and again until they eventually get the thing, or feel like they're slamming themselves into a wall to go, okay, it'll work, and here's the other factor that has introduced into in order to let you get away with this. Here's what else has popped into the scene. But now I want to write a game that engages with weather more often. There's a game jam, I think, currently running now that I need to work on a game for, called Cozy Game Jam. That's encouraging people to write games that are about coziness and the more gentle moments and less conflict. And I keep thinking of ideas that I feel like still have too much conflict, but there's a book I remember reading as a child that I think was called Thundercake, that's about baking as you hear a thunderstorm rolling in and counting how far away the storm is based on the sounds of the thunder relative to when the lightning cracks. And now I'm imagining, like, what kinds of weirdly, like, cozy or sweet games you could make that relate to weather ideas or mechanics. Like a game that's specifically about being stuck inside during the rain, or a game that's about, like, the effects of the heat of the middle of summer. So thank you for that. I'm going to think about weather more.
Awesome. Yay for ideas. I know something that I've noticed doesn't seem to get as much use is environment and how moving from one type of environment can to another. I was actually listening to a podcast the other day where they were talking about using mechanics to using environment kind of as a mechanic to really express to players the change in stuff when they're in certain layers or stuff, and how, like, say, being near a beholder layer, a lot of people forget to bring in all the stuff from not just the layer, outside the layer, the area it affects, or certain dragons or stuff, which poked an idea that I'm not going to talk anymore about because I've got players in here that will know things. Spoiler alert. Nope, no spoiler.
That's reminding me, there was that first the giant frog in the D&D game I first ran for my cousin. I was sort of playing with the idea of how in video games when you kill a big enemy, it often drops loot. So I had the giant frog. It had previously eaten several adventuring parties, so when they did eventually kill it, like, gold and magic items fell out of it because it had consumed several past adventuring parties, but not everything that it consumed was digestible. But it had swallowed an enchanted ice weapon, and so the area around the frog was always cold, and when it fell asleep in a harbor, the harbor started to freeze over. And then when they were fighting it, one of them got their arm frozen into it after stabbing it and was stuck there. So that's, like, kind of an environmental mechanic, but with some other weird dimensions too. But I drew them into a mysterious situation by there being this, like, strange frozen region of the harbor that ended up being, like, this frog that was essentially carrying its own environmental effect around with it all the time until they killed it and removed the ice weapon.
That's awesome.
It was a fun time. I liked getting to freeze someone's arm into the frog. It really added a lot of chaos to the fight.
What do you think? No, we just did that one. If you could play with 5 famous people in an RPG, who would you pick to join you?
Oh my gosh, that's a good question. I feel like make me want to organize things in my brain because there's a lot of different directions of fame, and I'm honestly not great at remembering who famous people are in some contexts. Honestly, the easy answer, just I would pick a bunch of people whose podcasts I like. Like if I could play in a game with a bunch of the one-shot podcasts, like common guests and the host James D'Amato, that would rock my socks off. But I should make this harder for myself and pick people who I don't automatically associate with RPGs. I feel like it would be, if I could do the historical people living or dead kind of situation, I think I would probably pull together like a lot of historical, like politically oriented folk musicians and play Riley Riethel's like I think it's called The Riot Starts. I can find this on Twitter. This is a good link, but the game The Riot Starts, it's also on itch.io. It's a game that I really want to play because it's based on the musical Hadestown, and it's about a workers' revolt in hell. And so I'd love to, if I could like pull together like Woody Guthrie and like some other historic like folk musicians and like labor organizers and play a game about a workers' revolt in hell with them, I think that would also be pretty dope. I would enjoy that.
That sounds really, really fun.
Yeah, I'm going to make a more comprehensive list because I'm thinking that I love blanking on names as soon as you ask me, but Woody Guthrie lives with me because I learned his song Tiny Kiddo. But there's more folks I'd add too.
It sounds like it could be a really, really epic one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if that was actually feasible, that would be something I would do. Maybe with modern folk musicians, still technically possible. Maybe someday. I'm adding that to the dream list.
Awesome. Okay, well, I think that just about wraps everything up for us here. Thanks for being on my show. It's been great having you.
Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, this was really lovely. I had a lot of conversation. I feel like I got to learn and think about some fun and different dimensions to game approaches. I enjoy the number of weird parallels in the D&D campaigns we run, and I'm really grateful to chat for the really cool questions. I had a lot of fun thinking about all of those, and those helped me build some more of my own game design ideas for moving forward with too. So thanks, chat.
All right. This has been RPG Unlimited. If you would like to keep up with Naomi, you can find her on Twitter at Adanarama. You can also find their products on itch.io / is it slash?
No worries. Yeah, if you want to find my work where I am Adanarama, that's ADANARAMA, on Twitter and on Patreon, and on itch.io you can download all of my games. I am beating the binary there, and all as one word. And if you want fun bonus print and play versions and cool zine formats and process materials for those games, all of those live on my Patreon.
Awesome. Thank you. So we are ending at this point. You can find my show here on Twitch every other Friday, as well as on other platforms the following week. And yeah, thank you so much for being with us today.